I needed time away from everything. That was the thought that pushed me to rent a small wooden cabin deep in the forest, miles away from any town, cell reception, or noise from the city. I had been working nonstop for months, feeling stressed, tired, and disconnected, and I thought that maybe some days alone in nature would help me reset. The cabin was a small old structure, built far away from the paved roads, surrounded by trees so thick and tall that sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. It stood on an old lot of land near a logging trail that was no longer in use. The listing had said it was private, quiet, and perfect for isolation, and that was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took most of the day. I had packed food, water, batteries, a portable charger, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, warmer clothes, and everything I thought I might need for a few days alone. The last part of the road was just dirt, and the deeper I drove, the darker and tighter the forest became. Tree branches hung over the road in places, brushing against the roof of my car as I passed. The air smelled of pine, dry leaves, and cold earth, and the forest life was loud with unseen insects and birds calling somewhere above. I remember arriving in the late afternoon, when the sun was low enough that the forest floor had already turned dark in many places. The cabin was small but solid, built of old weathered logs with a tin roof that looked rusty in spots. A short wooden porch stood in front with 2 steps, and a fire pit sat a few meters away surrounded by stones. There were no neighbors anywhere, no other cabins, no passing cars, nothing that reminded me of civilization. It was quiet in a way that felt both peaceful and strange, as though the world outside the forest did not exist. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked around. There was a small table, a cooking stove that worked with small propane tanks, a single bed pushed against the back wall, and a small window facing the trees behind the cabin. A wooden shelf held a few old books, a metal lantern, and some matches left by previous visitors. Even though the place was old, it felt sturdy and clean enough. I unpacked my things, placing my food in the small cupboard and setting my sleeping bag on the bed to make it more comfortable. The forest outside was quiet by the time I stepped back out. The temperature had dropped, and the sound of wind moving through the leaves became the loudest thing around. I walked a small circle around the cabin, getting familiar with the surroundings. Behind the cabin, the forest grew thick and dark immediately. Ferns, fallen branches, and tall moss-covered trunks formed a wall of nature that looked untouched for years. I could hear the sound of running water somewhere far away, maybe a stream, though I could not see it. The closest trail was a narrow dirt path that disappeared between the trees to the east, but it looked barely used. I spent the first evening settling in. I lit a small fire in the fire pit outside, cooked simple food, and watched the last light fade through the tops of the trees. When the sun was gone, darkness took over fast. The forest became pitch black in minutes, darker than anything I had experienced outside of the city or small towns. The only light was the fire beside me and the weak glow from the cabin window. The insects and birds went silent, replaced by the sound of wind moving through branches and the rustling of small animals somewhere out of sight. It was the kind of darkness that makes a person very aware that they are alone. I went inside before the fire fully burned out. With the lantern lit, the cabin felt warm and isolated from the world outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the silence. I had no phone reception at all, so there was no way to check messages or scroll through anything. In a way, it was the first time in months that nothing demanded attention. It felt strange, but good. I eventually laid down, listening to the sound of the wind outside. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I remembered was waking up in the middle of the night. I was not sure what woke me. The wind was still blowing gently outside, and for a moment, I just lay there staring at the dark ceiling. Then I realized there was a faint sound coming from outside the cabin. It was soft, irregular, and quiet enough that I had to focus to hear it clearly. It sounded like leaves or dirt being stepped on very slowly, as though someone was walking near the cabin and trying not to be heard. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. There were deer, raccoons, and other wildlife in the area. It would not be strange for something to move around outside while I slept. But the sound continued, slow steps, one at a time, not like the usual rustling and quick noise animals make when they move. It sounded measured, like the sound of a person taking slow, careful steps, sometimes stopping, then starting again. I lay completely still, listening harder, trying not to breathe too loudly. The steps seemed to move from one side of the cabin to another, as if someone was circling the structure. I stared into the darkness with my eyes wide open, feeling my chest tighten with fear. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with except maybe a kitchen knife. My flashlight was beside the bed, my boots near the wall. I considered getting up and checking the window, but I was afraid that if someone was out there, they might see movement or light inside. I stayed still for a long time, listening. Eventually the sound faded, swallowed by the wind and the movement of tree branches. I stayed awake long after, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. I finally fell asleep again sometime near dawn. When I woke, sunlight was coming through the small window, and the sound of birds had returned. The night felt distant and unreal in the daylight. I got out of bed, stretched, and stepped outside. The air was cold and fresh, and dew covered the ground. I walked slowly around the cabin, looking at the dirt and leaves, unsure of what I expected to find. There were no clear footprints, only the natural mess of forest floor. It would have been almost impossible to see footprints unless the ground had been soft mud, which it was not. I tried to shake off the feeling from the night. Maybe it really had been an animal. Maybe the silence and isolation had made my mind exaggerate the sounds. I spent the day hiking a short way through the forest, not far enough to risk getting lost, but enough to explore. The trees were tall and old, and sunlight filtered through branches in thin beams. The deeper I walked, the more it felt like the forest swallowed the world. There were fallen logs covered in moss, patches of ferns reaching up to my waist, and the occasional footprint of deer in patches of softer dirt. I found the small stream I had heard the night before. It was narrow and clear, winding through the trees with cold water rushing gently over smooth stones. I rested there for a while, listening to the water and watching insects move around the surface. There was no sign of other hikers or campers anywhere. It was strange how completely alone I was, how far away from anything human. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, feeling tired but relaxed. I cooked food on the stove inside, boiled water for tea, and sat outside on the porch as the light changed. The wind picked up again as the sun sank lower, and I watched the shadows grow longer. The forest became quiet again, just like the night before, as if every living thing knew that daylight was ending. As night settled, I lit the lantern and got ready for bed. I lay down, hoping the night would be quiet this time. For a while it was. I could hear the trees outside moving slightly with the wind, branches brushing against each other. But sometime later, long after I had closed my eyes, the sound returned. At first it was faint, almost hidden by the sound of the wind. Then I heard it clearly, the crunch of leaves, slow and careful, the same pattern as the night before. This time it seemed closer, maybe only a few feet outside the wall. I lay completely still again, listening. The sound moved from the front of the cabin to the side, then stopped for a moment before continuing. It was deliberate, slow, and heavy enough that it was impossible to mistake for a small animal. This was something larger. Someone walking outside the cabin, alone in the forest, late at night. A cold sweat formed on my skin. I tried to calm my breathing, but my heart was beating too fast. I thought about the fact that I had no reception, no way to call anyone. I thought about how far I was from the main road and how long it would take to run for help. I thought about what kind of person would be walking around a remote cabin in the dark without making their presence known. I listened for what felt like an hour as the sound circled the cabin again. At one point, I heard something brush against the wall outside, like a hand sliding across wood. I stared at the ceiling, not daring to move. I kept expecting the sound of the cabin door handle turning or footsteps on the porch. My mind replayed every possible scenario, none of them good. Eventually the sound faded again, just like the previous night. It disappeared completely, leaving only wind and silence. I remained awake until the first signs of daylight. That morning, I felt tired and uneasy. I walked the perimeter of the cabin again, looking at the ground. This time I found something. In an area where the dirt was softer near the back corner of the cabin, there was a clear footprint. It was the shape of a boot, not an animal print, and it was facing toward the cabin wall as though someone had been standing right there looking at the structure. I crouched and stared at it for a long time. The print was fresh enough that rain or wind had not erased it. I looked around and found another print a few feet away pointing in the direction of the forest. A heavy feeling settled in my stomach. This meant I had not imagined the sound. Someone had been outside during the night. Someone had been close enough to see the cabin clearly and possibly to look through the window if they tried. I stood in the silence of the morning trying to think clearly. The nearest town was far away. Even if I packed up and left immediately, it would take time to drive through the forest roads. I had planned to stay another night, but the idea now felt unsafe. I did not know who was out there or what they wanted. I decided I would leave that afternoon before dark. I packed some things and placed them in the car, but I kept some cooking supplies inside since I planned to eat one more meal before driving out. To pass time, I sat inside and read one of the old books from the shelf, though I couldn't focus on the words. Every sound outside made me tense. A branch snapping, wind moving through brush, anything that could be confused with footsteps. Around noon, I stepped outside to get some firewood to burn trash from cooking. I walked behind the cabin to collect fallen branches, and when I turned, I saw something that made my heart drop. Tucked between two tree roots near the edge of the trees was something metallic reflecting light. I walked closer and found a torn piece of metal from what looked like a cigarette lighter. It was old and rusted, but what mattered was not the object itself. It was where it was. Someone had stood there recently enough for the soft dirt to shift and small pieces of leaves to move aside. Someone had been standing just inside the tree line, close enough to watch the cabin for a long time without being seen. My hands trembled as I stood there staring at the spot. I turned slowly, scanning the trees and branches for any sign of movement. The forest stared back silently, but I felt completely watched. Goosebumps ran down my arms as I walked quickly back toward the cabin. I decided then that I would leave immediately. I didn't care if I left food behind or supplies. I went inside to gather the last of my things. As I packed, I heard a sound from the back window. It was soft, just the faint shift of fallen leaves being stepped on. But after the last 2 nights, I recognized it instantly. Someone was out there again. I froze where I stood. The sound came again, closer. I slowly reached for my flashlight, though I had no idea what good it would do. I waited, listening, staring at the window. The glass was small and dirty, and the outside light was bright enough that I could only see the shapes of trees and shadows. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard another slow step and another. The steps were approaching the cabin wall. I felt a strong urge to run outside and make a dash to the car, but I was afraid that whoever was out there was positioned to watch the door. I stood with my back pressed against the table, trying to stay calm. I had no idea if the person outside was armed, afraid, curious, dangerous, or something else entirely. The only thing I knew was that they had been watching the cabin at night for at least 2 nights, silently circling it, not approaching in daylight, not announcing themselves. The footsteps stopped directly outside the window. For several seconds, I stood completely still, barely breathing. Then I saw something move in the corner of the window frame, just a shadow, but a shape that did not belong to tree branches. Someone was standing close enough to look in. My body reacted before my mind did. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. I yanked it open and sprinted toward the car, not looking back. I half expected to hear footsteps chasing me, or someone calling out, but the forest remained silent. I reached the car, threw everything inside without care, and jumped in. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine started, and I accelerated down the dirt road as fast as I dared without losing control. As I drove through the twisting forest path, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The trees blurred by in shades of brown and green, and all I could think about was how exposed I was. It took nearly an hour before I reached the paved road again. I drove until I found a gas station in a small town. Only then, parked under bright lights with other cars around, did I finally breathe and feel some sense of safety. I considered reporting what happened. I stood outside my car with my heart still racing, thinking about footprints around the cabin, the sound of slow steps outside my walls, someone watching through the window in daylight. I imagined calling the local police and trying to explain that someone had been walking around the cabin at night. There was no evidence they broke in or harmed anything. I didn't know their face, height, or clothing. All I had were footprints and the fear that had grown inside me. I realized that even if I filed a report, there was little anyone could do. So I got back in my car and drove home, leaving the forest far behind. I had been looking for a way to disconnect from everything for a while. Life had become a heavy routine, with days feeling the same and weeks passing without anything meaningful happening. I wanted a place where I could be alone for a few days, away from people, noise, and screens. When I found a small rental cabin deep in the woods online, it seemed perfect. It was cheap, far away from any town, and surrounded by thick forest. The listing described it as quiet, isolated, and peaceful. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed lightly, taking only what I needed. Clothes, simple food, a flashlight, a battery bank, a small folding knife, a first aid kit, and a thin sleeping bag in case the bedsheets in the cabin looked questionable. I left early in the morning in my car. The drive was long and became more remote as I got deeper into the countryside. Asphalt roads became cracked, then turned into rough gravel paths. My phone signal went from weak to nothing. I did not care. This was what I wanted. Silence. Stillness. A place away from everything. The forest thickened as I drove. Trees leaned over the road, branches forming a natural canopy overhead. Sunlight came through in thin lines, warming the ground in uneven strips. There were no cars parked on the sides of the road. No houses, no people, just endless trees and the steady crunch of gravel under my tires. At one point, a deer ran across the road just a few meters ahead of my car. I slowed down, watching it disappear into the tree line. Nature was real out here. It did not care about anyone's schedule. The cabin appeared exactly as the listing photos showed. A small, weathered wooden structure, standing alone in a shallow clearing, surrounded by pine and birch trees. The air smelled like soil and wild plants. When I turned off the engine, everything went silent except for birds somewhere deeper in the woods. No wind, no cars, no aircraft overhead, just stillness. I stepped out of the car and took a moment to look around. The cabin did not look new or modern. The wood was old and the roof looked patched in a few areas. Some moss grew on the lower walls, but it felt solid, strong enough to stand against the forest. There was one small window on the front wall, two more on the sides, a short porch with a single step, and a door with a dark metal handle. I noticed there were no neighbors, no other cabins, no parked cars, no trails visible besides the one I had driven in on. Total isolation. This was what I had come for. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean enough. A wooden table, a small bed, a small kitchen area with an old stove, a metal sink with a pump handle to draw water, and shelves with some basic pans and plates. There was no electricity, but I knew that when booking. A small, old-style oil lamp sat on the table with a half-full oil glass. A window near the bed looked out into the forest, where the dark green trees stood closely together. The inside smelled like wood, cold air, and a faint trace of old smoke in the walls. I put my backpack on the table, stretched my shoulders, and then walked back outside. I stood for a while just listening. There was no sound of another human anywhere. No footsteps, no engine, no door slams. Nothing. Just forest. That silence was the reason I was here, but a small part of me felt the weight of how completely alone I was. If anything went wrong, no one would hear me. No one would know. But I told myself not to think like that. People camped and hiked here all the time. I was just being cautious. I took a short walk around the clearing. There were signs that someone had lived or stayed here before. A small fire pit with stones arranged in a rough circle, some burnt logs inside. Footprints in the dried soil near the edge of the porch. They looked old, washed out by time and rain. Behind the cabin, the trees grew thicker. A narrow animal trail ran into the woods, almost hidden by fallen leaves and small plants. I crouched down and looked at the ground. There were tracks, probably deer or similar animals. Nothing unusual. After settling in, I ate a simple meal and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. I walked down the gravel road a few hundred meters, but it turned and disappeared into more forest. There was a feeling that the world out here could stretch on forever with nothing changing. No houses, no farms, no signs of people. I began to feel time slow down in a good way. By evening, I returned to the cabin, lit the oil lamp, and sat at the table writing in a notebook I had brought. I wrote about how peaceful everything felt, how quiet the world became without other people. The warm light from the lamp gave the room a soft glow. Outside, the forest got darker until the windows turned almost black. There were no lights outside, no street lamps, nothing. Just the total darkness of nature. I was not scared, but the silence made me more alert. When you are used to living in a world filled with constant noise, cars, people talking, machines, phones, the complete absence of those sounds changes how you hear everything. Every small noise becomes louder. Every creak of the cabin would sounded like something much heavier. The wind brushing leaves sounded like movement. I could hear wildlife somewhere in the forest, faint but constant. After writing for a while, I prepared to sleep. The bed was old but firm. The sheets smelled like they had been washed but kept in a closed space for a long time. I lay down and listened to the silence. My breathing felt loud. I closed my eyes, and eventually I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night. I did not know what time it was, but the cabin was completely dark. I could barely see the faint outline of the window against the wall. I listened first because that was instinct. There was a soft sound coming from outside. At first, it was just a rustling, like leaves being moved. But then there was a slow, heavy step. Not fast, not constant, just one solid step, then another. I lay very still and tried to control my breathing. I knew there were animals in the woods, deer, maybe elk, maybe boar. Could be any of them. But the steps were slow and seemed careful, like something aware of making noise. I waited, listening. After a few seconds, the sound faded away. The forest returned to quiet. I stayed awake for a while, just listening, not moving. When nothing else happened, I eventually went back to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. I did not know what time it was, but the cabin was completely dark. I could barely see the faint outline of the window against the wall. I listened first because that was instinct. There was a soft sound coming from outside. At first, it was just a rustling, like leaves being moved. But then there was a slow, heavy step. Not fast, not constant, just one solid step. Then another. I lay very still and tried to control my breathing. I knew there were animals in the woods, deer, maybe elk, maybe boar. Could be any of them. But the steps were slow and seemed careful, like something aware of making noise. I waited, listening. After a few seconds, the sound faded away. The forest returned to quiet. I stayed awake for a while, just listening, not moving. When nothing else happened, I eventually went back to sleep. I woke up early in the morning. It was cold, and the cabin's air felt heavy. I stretched and opened the door to let in some fresh air. I looked at the ground outside and noticed something immediately. There were footprints near the edge of the cabin that had not been there before. They were not animal prints. They were shoe prints. A person had walked through the clearing while I slept. They were faint but clear, deep toe marks, defined heel edges. They came from the tree line and stopped near the cabin door, then turned and went back toward the forest. I looked around at the woods, scanning the trees for movement, but there was nothing. Everything looked the same. Still, calm. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker. Maybe someone living deep in the woods. Maybe someone passing through. But it bothered me that the prints came so close to the cabin. Whoever it was had come right up to the front door, stopped, and left. I spent the morning trying to push the thought away. I gathered some wood from the forest, cut it into smaller pieces using the small hatchet I found in the cabin, and stacked it near the fire pit. I boiled water on the stove and made simple food. I kept telling myself that footprints in the woods were not strange. People sometimes passed through remote areas. It was normal. Still, I decided I would pay more attention from now on. When you are alone in the wilderness, awareness becomes survival. Around noon, I took a longer walk into the forest, following the faint animal trail behind the cabin. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became. Trees blocked out most sunlight. The ground was uneven, with thorny plants and rotting branches. The air smelled like earth and wet wood. I noticed something after a few minutes, a tree with some kind of deep vertical cut in the bark. It looked like a large knife or blade had cut straight down the trunk. I touched the mark. It was not old. The wood underneath was still slightly fresh. I looked around and found another tree farther ahead with the same kind of mark. Then another. Someone had left these marks. They were spaced just far enough apart to guide someone who knew what they were looking for. I began to wonder if I was walking into an area where someone else lived, hunted, or moved regularly. A part of me considered turning around, but curiosity pushed me forward. I followed the marked trees for a while until something changed in the air. The forest became too quiet.
No birdsong, no insects buzzing.
Just stillness. I felt something in my chest, an instinctive warning. I stopped and listened. Nothing moved. That was the problem. Forests are rarely truly silent unless something causes them to be. I turned around slowly, and that was when something caught my eye near the ground. A small piece of cloth was stuck to a thorn bush. Faded grayish fabric, torn in a straight line, like from a shirt sleeve. I picked it up and examined it. It looked weathered, but not too old. Someone had passed through here and not that long ago. I folded the cloth and put it in my pocket, then slowly walked back the way I had come. I moved quietly, listening carefully. Every snapped twig under my foot felt loud. I kept looking behind me, scanning between the trees. The walk back felt longer than the walk in, but eventually I stepped back into the clearing near the cabin. The air felt normal again. Birds were chirping. I took a slow breath, relieved. I spent the rest of the afternoon inside the cabin, writing and reading. I tried to relax, but a sense of alertness stayed in the back of my mind like a weight. I told myself that I didn't come here to be paranoid. Still, being fully alone without other people nearby changes how your instincts work. You start thinking in terms of survival even when nothing is wrong yet. As the sun went down, the forest became dark again. I lit the oil lamp and checked that the cabin door was locked. I lay on the bed fully awake, waiting for the feeling of calm that had been there the day before to return. But it didn't. I closed my eyes and listened to the night. It was quiet for a long time. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard something again. A single step outside. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Then another. Someone was outside the cabin. Not passing through. Not moving randomly. Standing there. My heart started beating faster. I did not move. I just listened. The footsteps stopped right outside the wall near the head of the bed. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. I did not hear the steps leave. I did not hear movement. I lay awake for hours until exhaustion finally made my eyes close. I never planned to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, but I felt like I needed a break from everything in my life. Things at home were stressful. I was tired of hearing constant noise, traffic, phones ringing, people knocking, appointments, and all the daily pressure that never seemed to end. I wanted quiet. I wanted a place where I could just sit down and breathe and feel like I was alone in the world. I thought a remote cabin in the middle of the forest would give me exactly that. I had no idea how wrong I was. I drove out early in the morning so I could get there before dark. I had rented the cabin online. It was old and basic, but it looked clean and safe. It sat about 20 miles away from the nearest small town, surrounded by thick forests and rough dirt roads that most people never used. According to the listing, it had electricity from a generator, clean water from a well, and no Wi-Fi or phone signal. When I booked it, that sounded perfect. I didn't want people contacting me, because I felt like that was the only way to get real peace. The last 10 miles of the drive were slow. The road became narrow, uneven, and filled with deep potholes. My tires cracked over sticks and gravel, and I could feel the forest closing in the further I went. Tall trees pushed in on both sides, pressing close until sunlight barely touched the ground. I kept going forward, and for a moment I felt good. I was finally leaving the noise behind. No traffic, no power lines, no signs, no houses, no people. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sky was starting to turn orange. The cabin was small, made from old gray logs that were dark from weather and age. A small shed stood a little distance away, maybe for tools or firewood. There was a narrow porch with 2 wooden steps and a green door that looked like it had been painted 10 years ago. There was nothing else around. No other cabins, no roads, no fences. Just nature, endless and quiet. I sat in my car for a minute before getting out. The engine shut off and suddenly everything became silent. I could hear the sound of wind in the trees, faint scraping of branches, the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, but in a strange way it was also unsettling. When you live around people your whole life, real silence feels like emptiness, like the world stopped. I got out, stretched my back, and carried my bags inside. The cabin was simple. 1 room with a small kitchen area, a bed, a table with 1 chair, a wood stove, and a bathroom that used the well water. There was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling with a pull chain. It worked when I tugged it, but the generator outside made a low, steady hum that never stopped. The fridge also worked, but it looked old and had some rust around the door. I put my food inside, unpacked, and stood for a moment looking around. The place smelled like old wood and dust, but it wasn't dirty. Everything was quiet. I walked over to the single window on the front wall and looked outside. The clearing was already dim, and the tree line looked darker than before. The sun was dropping fast, and I realized I had not seen another house or person for miles. That should have made me feel relaxed, but instead it gave me a strange feeling in my stomach, like I had stepped too far away from the world. I heated a can of soup on the stove, ate quietly, and then walked outside for fresh air. The moment I stepped out, the temperature dropped. I could see the last red light of the sunset behind the trees, and shadows stretched long across the ground. I listened carefully and realized I could not hear cars, machines, people, or anything human. Just wind, crickets, and the very distant sound of water dripping far away. The air was cold and smelled like pine and dirt. I stood there until the sky grew dark enough that I needed the flashlight from my car just to see the steps. I finally went inside, locked the door, and turned off the generator light. The cabin became almost completely black. I went to bed early, thinking I would sleep well without the noise of the world around me. Instead, the silence kept me awake. It was so complete that every tiny sound felt loud. The ticking of the cooling stove, the faint vibration of the generator outside, the rustle of branches brushing against the roof. I lay on my back staring into the darkness for what felt like hours before I finally drifted off. I didn't know what time it was when I woke up the first time. There are no clocks in the cabin, and I didn't bother checking my phone since I knew it had no signal. I woke because I heard something outside. At first I thought it was a deer or raccoon. It was a soft crunch on the dried leaves, slow, and spaced apart like careful footsteps. I lay there listening with my heart beating in my chest. The footsteps moved slowly from one side of the cabin toward the front door, and then everything went quiet again. I told myself it was just an animal. The woods are full of them. I forced myself to breathe slowly and eventually fell back asleep. The second time I woke up, I was covered in sweat even though the air was cold. I heard something again. Not footsteps this time. It was a faint metallic sound, like metal brushing metal. It was coming from the front of the cabin. I lay completely still, holding my breath, listening as hard as I could. The sound continued for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. After that, I heard the quiet crunch of leaves again, slowly moving away into the trees. I stayed awake a long time after that, staring into darkness and listening to every tiny noise. My nerves were sharp, and the silence started to feel heavy like it was pressing against me. When I finally fell asleep again, it was because I was too tired to stay awake. In the morning, sunlight through the window woke me. For a moment, I had forgotten about the noises in the night. I got up, stretched, and then something hit me the moment I looked at the front door. The metal latch on the outside looked slightly bent. It was subtle, but I remembered exactly how it looked when I arrived. It had been straight. Now it had a slight twist, as if someone had tried to move it. My first thought was that maybe it had rusted loose overnight or the wind had blown something into it, but that didn't make sense. It had looked strong and solid before. Wind couldn't bend it. That metallic sound from the night came back into my head. I suddenly remembered how slow and careful the noises had been. Not like an animal running, more like someone moving quietly because they didn't want to be heard. I told myself I was overthinking. When you are alone in the woods, your brain turns every sound into danger. I made breakfast, washed my face, and tried to settle my nerves. I stepped outside to get some fresh air, and that's when I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt and leaves near the porch. They weren't clear shoe prints, but they were from a boot or something similar. They were fresh too. The ground still looked pressed in, and the rain from 2 days earlier had left the soil soft enough to show the marks. I stared at them for a long time. They didn't look like animal tracks. They looked human. My heart was beating hard again, and I looked around the trees, but I saw nothing moving. The forest looked still and calm. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving right then, but I had paid for the cabin, and I didn't want to run away after one night. I kept telling myself that maybe a hunter or hiker had passed by, even though I had driven for hours without seeing another house. Maybe someone used the woods regularly. Maybe they had just walked past and checked the cabin out of curiosity. I tried to shake the worry off and spent most of the day outside exploring the area near the cabin. I walked through the trees, following no real path, just wandering. I found nothing unusual, just moss, dirt, trees, old fallen logs, small animal tracks, and pine needles covering the ground like a blanket. No signs of people. When I got back to the cabin in the afternoon, I looked at the footprints again. They were still there and they still looked fresh. I checked the shed but found only old tools and firewood. Nothing strange. I went inside, closed the door, and tried to relax. The sun began to go down again, and I realized how quickly the woods turned dark. It was only 5 or 6 in the evening, but the shadows were already long. I heated more food on the stove and ate slowly. The silence grew again, thicker than before. I kept thinking about the metal sound, the way the latch looked slightly bent, the footprints. I tried to distract myself by reading one of the old books left in the cabin, but every 10 or 15 minutes I would stop and listen, making sure I wasn't hearing noises outside. The longer I sat there, the more I realized how alone I was.
No neighbors.
No signal. No roads that anyone would casually take. If something happened, there was no one to help. I was starting to understand why silence could feel dangerous. When it got late, I turned off the light and went to bed. I lay there for a long time waiting for sleep, but I was too alert. Every sound made my muscles tense. I could hear tree branches scraping lightly across the roof. The generator hummed outside. The wind made faint noises through the trees. I closed my eyes and tried to block everything out, but my mind was racing. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up again, and when I did, I knew immediately something was wrong. There was no generator sound. The cabin was completely silent. I sat up in bed so fast I almost made it creak. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. I could see nothing except faint outlines from the window. I listened, and I could hear the sound of my own breathing and nothing else. The generator never turns off unless someone turns it off. I sat there frozen and terrified. Then, after maybe 5 seconds, I heard something outside. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving across the leaves toward the front of the cabin. My entire body went cold. Someone was out there. I wanted a quiet break from everything, and the small cabin in the mountains looked perfect. It was listed as old but comfortable, isolated but not dangerous, and the reviews said people who wanted time alone would enjoy it. That was exactly what I needed. I had been stressed for months, tired of noise, tired of constant messages, tired of pressure from everyone in my life. I wanted silence, long nights, cold air, and the feeling of not having to be around anyone for a while. The cabin was rented for 1 week, and I packed light because I expected nothing strange. I brought basic clothes, toiletries, canned food, a knife, a small toolkit, and my phone. I did not expect problems. The road to the cabin was an old mountain road, narrow, uneven, surrounded by thick trees. The deeper I drove, the less my phone signal worked. By the time I reached the last 10 kilometers, there was no signal at all. I had expected that. The listing said the area had weak reception. I told myself that was fine, since I was there to disconnect anyway. The air was cold and clean, and I kept the window down to smell the pine trees and the damp ground. Felt good at that moment. The road twisted higher into the mountains until the forest closed in so tightly that I could no longer see far beyond the tree line. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was almost gone. The building was small, old, wooden, and dark, but it looked stable. A thin trail continued past it into deeper woods, but it was already too dark to see where it went. The cabin was the only building in sight, with no other houses visible through the forest. That isolation was peaceful at that moment. I unlocked the cabin, stepped inside, and smelled old wood and dust. It was not dirty, just aged. Inside were simple wooden floors, a kitchen counter, a small bathroom, a bed, and a metal stove for heating. A single wide window faced the trees outside. I closed the door, dropped my bags, and sat down on the bed, enjoying the quiet. At first, the silence was comforting, but after a few minutes I realized how total it was. No car sounds, no birds, no insects, no wind, nothing. I had never heard silence like that before, and it felt unnatural. I told myself the forest was probably settling for the evening and that animals were simply winding down. I prepared a simple canned meal, ate, washed the dish, and unpacked. I turned on the battery-powered lantern I brought because the cabin had limited electricity, and I knew I might need extra light. The temperature dropped quickly. The air inside the cabin became cold enough to see my breath if I stood near the window. I put wood into the stove and lit a fire. The metal creaked as it heated, and soon the room filled with a stable warmth. I sat by the fire for a long time, enjoying the quiet, trying to relax. By midnight, I was tired. I turned the lantern low and lay down. I expected I would sleep well, but I could not. My body was tired, but my mind stayed awake, focusing on the silence outside. I had lived in noisy environments all my life, and the total absence of sound felt wrong, like pressure against my ears. I lay still for nearly an hour until finally I slipped into sleep. I woke up at 3 a.m. with a sudden feeling that something was not right. The fire was almost out, and the cabin was cold again. For a moment, I did not understand what woke me, but then I realized I had heard something. Not a voice or anything strange like that, just a sound outside. Something heavy stepped on dried leaves. Then another step. Then silence again. My heartbeat sped up. I told myself it was probably a deer or another animal moving through the woods. The area was full of wildlife. Still, I found myself staring at the door and window, trying to see through the darkness. The lantern was dim, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I lay there for maybe 5 minutes without hearing anything else. The more time passed, the more I felt I had overreacted. I got up, fed more wood into the stove, warmed up the room, and eventually went back to bed. I slept again, but not comfortably, waking up several times before morning. The next day was quiet and calm. I made breakfast, organized my supplies, walked around the woods for a short time, and took in the scenery. The trees were tall and dense, and there was a damp smell of moss and rotting leaves. The air was clean but heavy with moisture. I found old footprints along the trail that did not look fresh, maybe leftover from previous visitors. I returned to the cabin after a couple of hours and spent the rest of the day resting. The silence bothered me less in daylight. I read, wrote in a notebook, ate, and watched the fire. It felt peaceful again. By the time evening came, the silence returned to the same unnatural level as the night before. I tried to ignore it. I cooked, cleaned, and set up some items on a table. I noticed something small and strange while rearranging my things. The kitchen window had a faint smudge on the outside, close to the bottom corner, like something had touched it. Could have been anything. Maybe water, maybe dirt, maybe condensation. Still, it stuck in my mind because I had cleaned the window earlier and I was certain it was not there before. I wiped it off and tried not to think about it. Night fell faster than I expected. The trees outside blocked most light, and once again the cabin was surrounded by complete darkness. With no signal on my phone, no radio, and no background noise, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. I sat by the fire again, trying to shake the unusual anxiety I felt. I tried to blame it on being in a new place and being unused to isolation. I forced myself to relax until fatigue finally set in. I was in bed by midnight, hoping sleep would come faster than the night before. The fire was burning slowly, giving the cabin just enough warmth. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, trying to clear the tension from my muscles. But again, I woke up around 3 a.m. This time it was not a single sound that woke me. Instead, it was the absence of sound that disappeared. The silence was broken by something moving outside. The sound was subtle but unmistakable. Something large stepped on twigs and dry leaves, slowly approaching the cabin. I lay completely still, eyes open, muscles tight, heart pounding against my ribs. The footsteps moved closer and then stopped right outside the cabin wall. My breathing became shallow. I listened with absolute focus. Nothing happened for several seconds, and then something touched the cabin wall. Not a knock, but a slow, pushing pressure, like someone or something leaned against the outside panel. It moved along the wall, slow and heavy. The wood creaked softly under the weight. I could not see anything from where I was lying. I wanted to get up, but I felt rooted in place, frozen by the idea that if I stood up, whatever was outside might hear the movement. The pressure on the wall shifted slowly toward the window. I stared into the darkness of the room, waiting for something to happen. After a long, silent pause, the sound stopped completely. I stayed awake for nearly an hour before I finally convinced myself that it was probably a large animal, maybe leaning against the wall to scratch its side. The situation still left a deep discomfort inside me. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check the area. The air was cold and fog spread across the ground in thin layers. I walked slowly around the cabin, expecting to find disturbed dirt, deep tracks, or something unusual. At first, I did not see anything. Then, near the wall where the sound had come from, I noticed the ground was slightly displaced. Leaves and twigs had been pushed aside by something. The marks did not look like deer tracks or any animal I recognized. They were not clear footprints, but the ground had been pressed down in a wide shape, as if something heavy had stood or leaned there. Could have been a bear, but the size and shape did not match the prints I had seen in nature documentaries or books. I stared at the ground for a long time, trying to reason through it logically. I reminded myself that I was alone, that isolated environments always create paranoia, and that the mind naturally exaggerates danger when there is no one else around. I tried to ignore the uneasiness and went back inside, but I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The smudge on the window the day before, the heavy footsteps, the leaning on the wall, everything was building into something I did not yet understand. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was hidden deep in the woods, far enough from any main road that Google Maps barely recognized the area. The trees were thick, dark pines that blocked sunlight even at midday, and the dirt road leading there was rutted and overgrown, twisting through hills and shallow streams. I had been planning this solo getaway for weeks, craving silence, a break from the constant noise of the city, and the pressure of work that never seemed to end. I wanted to disappear, even if just for a few days, into a place where nothing mattered except keeping myself fed, warm, and safe. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single-story structure, made of rough, dark wood, its roof sagging slightly at the edges. The windows were grimy, though intact, and the front door had a heavy latch with a padlock. I had a key, provided by the person I rented it from, but even as I fitted it into the lock, I felt a flicker of unease, a part of me instinctively aware that isolation, in this place, was absolute. No neighbors, no nearby cabins, just the forest and me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint, sour tang of mildew. There was a small living area with a cracked sofa, a wooden table with a few chipped chairs, a kitchenette with a rusted stove, and a small bathroom with a toilet that flushed sluggishly. The bedroom was minimal. A narrow bed with thin blankets, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto the trees. Everything was functional but rough, like it had been left behind years ago, yet somehow kept. I unpacked slowly, making sure to note the details of my surroundings. The walls creaked slightly whenever the wind blew through the trees, and I could hear the forest in a way I never had in the city. The crack of branches, the low rustle of leaves, the distant howl of some animal I couldn't identify. At first, it was peaceful, almost comforting. The cabin felt like a small refuge, a shelter against the vastness of the woods. That first night, I made a fire in the stone fireplace. The wood was dry enough to catch, though it smoked more than I expected. I cooked a simple meal, canned beans and some bread I brought with me, and sat near the fire, watching the flames dance. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows. Even with the fire burning, the forest felt like it extended forever, a black wall just beyond the thin glass. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, just the night, nothing more. Sleep was uneasy. The bed was hard, the blankets thin, and every creak of the cabin made me startle. I kept my phone on the table beside me, though reception was patchy at best. I thought about turning on music or a podcast, but I wanted silence. I wanted to hear the forest, not block it out. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a shallow sleep. The next morning, I woke early. The sun barely reached the cabin through the thick canopy, but it was enough to see the floorboards, the dust, the small scratches along the walls that might have been made by animals or by time itself. I stepped outside, feeling the damp earth beneath my boots. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil. Mist hung in the valleys between the trees, moving like slow, gray smoke. I wandered along the path that led to a small creek I had noticed the day before. The water was clear but icy, running over smooth stones. I knelt to drink some, the cold shocking against my lips. Even in the brightness of day, the forest felt alive, watching, waiting. As the hours passed, I explored more of the area near the cabin. There were animal tracks I couldn't identify, deep impressions in the mud that suggested something large had passed through recently. I felt a twinge of unease but pushed it aside, reminding myself that it was unlikely anything would come near the cabin. Predators avoided humans, usually, and I was careful to make noise while walking. Evening came quickly, faster than I expected. The sun sank behind the hills, and shadows spread across the forest floor. I gathered more wood for the fireplace, preparing for another night of cold. I ate, cleaned up, and tried to settle in. But that night was different. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. A slow, deliberate snap of a branch, somewhere outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. The sound repeated, followed by a faint rustle, like something moving through leaves. I checked my phone. No signal. The fire had died down to embers. Darkness filled every corner of the room. My heart was pounding, my hands clammy. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and shone it toward the window. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, the moonlight reflecting off the leaves. The noise stopped. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but a small, rational part of me knew the forest wasn't empty. Something had moved near the cabin, and it hadn't sounded small. Hours passed in that tense half-sleep. Every crack of the cabin, every distant howl of an animal, made me startle. I kept the flashlight beside me, and every so often I would shine it toward the window, seeing only trees. By morning, exhaustion had replaced fear, though unease lingered like a shadow in my mind. The days that followed were tense. I started noticing small things that didn't make sense. Footprints around the cabin that I hadn't left. Items slightly out of place, like the firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered in the morning. My pack, which I had left by the door, shifted positions. At first, I thought I was imagining it, sleep-deprived and anxious. But by the third day, it became undeniable. Someone, or something, was moving around my cabin while I slept. I didn't see anyone during the day, but at night the sounds returned. Branches snapping underfoot, the faint scrape of metal, like the latch on the door being touched, then silence. I started keeping the door locked at all times, barricading it with a chair, and sleeping with a large kitchen knife beside me. Every shadow made me flinch. Every wind gust felt like a presence. I considered leaving, going back to the city, but each time I tried to plan an early exit, I realized the car was buried in mud from the constant rain, the road back almost impassable. I had underestimated how isolated this place was. Leaving on foot would mean hours through dense, uneven forest, possibly encountering whatever had been around my cabin. The fear of that kept me trapped, alone with the creeping anxiety that grew heavier with each passing night. By the fifth night, my nerves were raw. I slept only in short bursts, waking to every sound. The cabin felt alive with movement, floorboards creaking when no wind blew, shadows in the corners that seemed to stretch when I looked directly at them. I rationed my food, keeping only enough to last a few more days, planning for an escape. I tried not to think about the footprints or the noises, but my mind was relentless. Then, on the sixth night, it happened. I woke to the sound of the front door latch sliding. Someone had touched it. My heart froze. I grabbed the knife and the flashlight, shaking, and moved toward the door. I shined the light through the window. There, barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure crouched, moving slowly back and forth. I couldn't see the face, only the outline. A person, maybe a man, moving like a predator, testing the latch, watching the cabin. Panic overtook me. I stayed frozen for a few minutes, debating whether to confront, hide, or run. Then I realized the only safe option was to wait until the figure left. I held my breath, keeping the flashlight hidden, listening to every movement. Slowly, the figure retreated, melting into the forest. My legs shook uncontrollably, and I barely slept the rest of the night. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I gathered my essentials, packed quickly, and prepared to leave despite the treacherous road. As I stepped outside, the forest was quiet, almost serene in the daylight. I kept my eyes on the shadows, every sound amplified in my mind. I moved quickly, boots sinking into mud, sweat dripping down my face from exertion and fear. The path back was longer than I remembered, the trees seeming closer together, the terrain steeper. When I finally reached the car, mud-caked and exhausted, I locked the doors and started the engine. The vehicle struggled at first but eventually roared to life. I drove slowly, carefully navigating the muddy road until I reached a paved highway. Only then did I allow myself to relax slightly, though the feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't return to that cabin. Weeks later, I found out from the rental agency that the previous tenant had reported someone breaking into their cabin as well. They never caught the person. The agency refused further explanation, only warning me that the area was remote, and locals sometimes acted strangely toward outsiders. I learned a lot from that experience. About fear, about isolation, about the sharpness of instinct when your safety is in question. I also learned to respect the forest, not as a mystical place, but as a place where humans are strangers, where the wrong encounter can have real consequences. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see the cabin, dark and silent among the trees, feel the cold floor under my fingers as I gripped the knife, and hear the faint snap of a branch in the distance. I survived, but the memory never left me, and I never went back. I had planned the cabin trip for weeks. The idea of a few days alone in the woods, away from the noise and the rush of the city, had sounded like the perfect escape. I needed silence, space, and a break from everything that had been piling up: emails, bills, deadlines, the constant hum of traffic outside my apartment. I had packed carefully, filling a large backpack with essentials. Enough food for 4 days, bottled water, a portable stove, a heavy-duty flashlight with extra batteries, a first aid kit, a Swiss Army knife, waterproof matches, and a thin sleeping bag that was rated for mild cold. The cabin itself was in a remote area a few hours from the nearest town. I had rented it through a website, and the photos looked cozy. A small wooden building with a single bedroom, a living area with a fireplace, and a kitchen. Beyond that, the surrounding forest stretched for miles, dense with pines and firs, with a river not far from the cabin. The drive out was quiet, just the occasional rumble of my car tires over uneven asphalt and gravel. When I finally turned off the main road and followed the narrow dirt path leading into the woods, I noticed how quickly the air changed. It smelled cleaner, heavier with pine, and somehow colder. Sunlight filtered in thin beams through the canopy, casting long shadows over the trail. By the time I arrived at the cabin, my stomach was fluttering with the mix of excitement and unease that always comes when I step into isolation. The cabin was exactly as pictured, but in reality, it felt smaller and older. The wooden walls had a faded gray hue, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dusty. I left my car parked at the edge of the clearing and walked up to the porch. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, echoing unnaturally in the quiet air. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint mildew scent, though it was not overpowering. I set my backpack down and began to explore, checking the kitchen for supplies, the bedroom for extra blankets, and the living area, where a small fireplace promised warmth for the nights ahead. Everything seemed in order, though I noticed the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the corner, probably from a leak I couldn't immediately locate. I spent the first evening unpacking and organizing my things. The sun had dropped low behind the trees when I lit a small fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling loudly, echoing through the small cabin. Outside, the forest was a shadowed mass, and the quiet was so absolute that my own heartbeat sounded loud. I ate a simple dinner and drank water from a bottle, then sat on the porch for a while, watching as the sky turned dark and the first stars began to appear. The world beyond the cabin seemed to vanish entirely. It was serene, but there was also a subtle tension, a sense of being watched by the emptiness of the woods. Night came fully, and I went to bed earlier than usual. I lay in the small bed with the thin blanket pulled over me, listening to the forest sounds, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird, and something that sounded like the soft snap of a branch. I told myself it was nothing, the ordinary noises of wildlife moving through the night. Still, sleep came fitfully. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than they should, and the wind made the cabin walls groan in a way that made me tense. The next morning, I woke early, the first light of dawn filtering through the thin curtains. I made a simple breakfast and decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, and the terrain uneven. I followed a small trail that ran alongside the river, enjoying the sound of the water rushing over rocks. As I walked, I noticed the underbrush was denser than I had expected, and the trees grew so closely together that the path was sometimes difficult to follow. I marked my route in my mind, careful not to stray too far. Later that afternoon, I returned to the cabin to rest and prepare a meal. I noticed the door, which I had securely locked in the morning, seemed slightly ajar. A small chill ran down my spine. I had been careful. No one else had a key. I checked the windows. They were all closed and intact. I shrugged it off, telling myself the wind must have pushed it open. I double-checked the locks and went about my evening routine. But the feeling of unease lingered, and I noticed myself glancing over my shoulder more often, listening for noises I couldn't immediately identify. The second night brought a heavier sense of tension. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees groan like they were straining under the force. I stayed by the fireplace, stacking logs and keeping it burning high. At some point, I heard a noise outside, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on the forest floor. My heart started to race, and I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped abruptly. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some small predator, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there watching. I kept the flashlight beside me and checked all the locks again before reluctantly going to bed. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by the occasional noise outside and the sound of my own breath, loud in the otherwise empty cabin. The following morning, I decided to explore a bit farther from the cabin. I packed water and some food, telling myself I would follow the river upstream for a while. The forest thickened as I walked, and the trail became harder to navigate. Fallen branches and rocks slowed my pace, and I had to climb small hills and maneuver around dense patches of brush. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The sound of the river was my only companion, along with the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth. A few hours into the hike, I noticed a faint trail of footprints in the soft mud near the riverbank. They were human-sized and relatively fresh. My stomach tightened. I had seen no one in the forest since arriving, and these tracks weren't mine. I followed them cautiously, telling myself they could belong to a hiker who had passed earlier, but a creeping sense of unease built in my chest. The footprints eventually disappeared into thicker brush, and I decided it was best not to stray too far. I turned back toward the cabin, moving faster now, my mind alert for any unusual sounds. By the time I returned, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin seemed darker than usual. I noticed immediately that my door lock was damaged. It hadn't been like that before. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the windows, they were still intact. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. I took a deep breath, thinking maybe the door had been forced slightly by wind or some accident, though the wind hadn't been strong enough for that. I reinforced the lock with my knife and some heavy furniture, creating a makeshift barricade. My hands trembled slightly, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a branch, every gust of wind against the walls, sent me sitting upright in bed, heart racing. The shadows outside seemed closer, and I felt the cabin's walls pressing in around me. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, listening for any sound of movement. I considered calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and the thought of leaving the cabin in the dark unsettled me. On the third day, I decided I couldn't stay put. The sense of danger had become too real, too suffocating. I packed everything I could into my backpack, double-checking that I had water, food, and my knife. I planned to leave at first light and head back to the main road, sticking to the trail I had marked the first day. My sleep was fitful, filled with half-formed dreams of someone entering the cabin, and I woke several times to the sound of the wind and distant snapping branches. Before dawn, I slipped quietly out of the cabin. The forest was thick with mist, and visibility was low. I stuck to the trail as best as I could, moving cautiously but quickly. Hours passed, and the mist began to lift. I felt increasingly tense with every step, checking over my shoulder constantly. The trail was harder to follow in some parts, overgrown and obscured by fallen trees. My energy was waning, and the backpack felt heavier with each passing mile. Around midday, I finally saw the edge of the forest and a stretch of the main road in the distance. Relief flooded through me, but I remained cautious. I broke into a run, knowing that any pause could be dangerous. As I neared the road, I finally saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed to a stop. I climbed in, exhausted, shaking, and explained as best I could that I had been alone in the woods and something had made me fear for my life. The driver listened quietly and offered to take me to the nearest police station, which I accepted without hesitation. At the station, I filed a report. They noted the broken door lock and advised me that someone may have entered the cabin while I was exploring. But without evidence, it was impossible to prove. I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. The experience had left me hyper-aware of my surroundings and deeply cautious, but I was alive, and I had made it back safely. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with authorities to investigate. The door had indeed been forced, and there were signs someone had moved around inside. Nothing valuable had been taken, suggesting perhaps the intruder was looking for shelter rather than stealing. It was a chilling reminder that isolation in the wilderness carries real risks. I never went back to that cabin, and I avoided traveling alone in remote areas after that. But the experience taught me the importance of preparation, vigilance, and respecting the unknown hazards of even seemingly quiet, peaceful places. The forest that once seemed inviting and serene had become a place I would never see in the same light. The memory of those tense nights, the oppressive quiet, and the ever-present sense of being watched stayed with me. Yet, the clarity of surviving it, of making careful choices under pressure, gave me a strange sense of strength. I had faced fear in a very real, very human form, and I had come through. The ending was not magical or comforting. It was the reality of survival. And in that reality, I found a lasting lesson. Preparation, awareness, and resilience are sometimes the only things standing between safety and danger. I had been planning this trip for months, and I thought I had prepared for everything. The cabin I rented was tucked deep in the mountains, far away from the small town I drove through to get there. The GPS stopped giving signals miles before the trailhead, and after that, it was nothing but the rough dirt road, winding through thick pine forests. My car struggled over the uneven surface, scraping the undercarriage once or twice. I kept telling myself it would be worth it. Peace, isolation, a weekend to myself, away from phones, traffic, and the hum of daily life. The cabin itself was older than I expected. From the outside, it looked like a log structure patched together over decades. Some logs weathered to gray, others darker as if replaced more recently. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were thick with grime, leaving only streaks of the outside world visible from the inside. Still, it had a certain charm, the kind that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the otherwise empty rooms. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace and 2 bedrooms. The furniture was minimal, an old wooden table, a few chairs, and a rickety bed in each room. I set my backpack down and began to unpack, checking the supplies I had brought. I had food, water, batteries, a lantern, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove, though the fireplace was what I planned to use for heat and cooking. I spent the first afternoon gathering firewood. The forest around the cabin was dense, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight barely pierced through the tall trees. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I dismissed it, telling myself it was the wind, the shadows, or the occasional animal rustling through the underbrush. But the feeling persisted, nagging at the edge of my thoughts. By late afternoon, I had enough wood to last the evening and the night. I started a fire in the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and the small crackling of flames. The cabin seemed quieter than I expected. No birds, no rustling animals, nothing beyond the occasional gust of wind brushing against the trees outside. I cooked a simple meal, and as I ate, I stared into the fire, feeling an unease I couldn't place. Night fell faster than I had anticipated. The forest outside became a solid wall of black, only broken by the faint shimmer of moonlight through the trees. I lit the lantern and explored the cabin more thoroughly, checking windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. One of the windows in the back bedroom was slightly open. I was certain I had closed it. The latch was broken, and the window could be opened with a slight push. I locked it the best I could and told myself maybe I had missed it earlier. Sleep came slowly. Every sound outside, the snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made my heart jump. Around midnight, I was woken by a noise at the front door, a soft thump, like something heavy being dropped or pressed against the wood. I froze, holding my breath, listening. It happened again, a rhythmic knock this time, slow and deliberate. My first thought was a deer or some animal, but the sound was too controlled, too steady. I stayed still for a long time, waiting. When nothing else happened, I convinced myself it was my imagination, the wind, or perhaps the old cabin settling. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest seemed denser the further I went, shadows pooling in places where the sun barely reached. I marked the trail behind me, noting landmarks so I could find my way back. As I moved deeper, I noticed broken branches and flattened undergrowth. At first, I assumed it was deer paths or small animals, but then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Footprints. Large, irregular, and deep, they led toward the cabin and then away again. They weren't human, not quite, too wide, too deep for me to ignore. I returned to the cabin as quickly as possible, my mind racing. I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure everything was secure. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every sound outside made me tense. I kept the lantern lit, sitting near the fireplace, the fire providing some comfort. At one point, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, and measured. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering. They stopped as suddenly as they had started. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, planning to drive back to town as soon as possible. That's when I saw the tracks again, this time around the cabin. They circled the structure, sometimes close to the walls, sometimes farther out. There were marks in the soil that suggested heavy objects had been dragged, though nothing was missing or out of place inside. I felt trapped, the isolation of the cabin suddenly suffocating. I tried to start my car, but it wouldn't turn over. Battery dead. I checked my phone, no signal. Panic rose in my chest, cold and sharp. I went back inside, trying to calm myself, thinking through my options. I could hike to the main road, but the forest was thick, the trail barely visible. And those tracks, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Whatever had been here, it had been moving around the cabin all night, unseen. A few hours into the hike, I noticed a faint trail of footprints in the soft mud near the riverbank. They were human-sized and relatively fresh. My stomach tightened. I had seen no one in the forest since arriving, and these tracks weren't mine. I followed them cautiously, telling myself they could belong to a hiker who had passed earlier, but a creeping sense of unease built in my chest. The footprints eventually disappeared into thicker brush, and I decided it was best not to stray too far. I turned back toward the cabin, moving faster now, my mind alert for any unusual sounds. By the time I returned, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin seemed darker than usual. I noticed immediately that my door lock was damaged. It hadn't been like that before. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the windows, they were still intact. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. I took a deep breath, thinking maybe the door had been forced slightly by wind or some accident, though the wind hadn't been strong enough for that. I reinforced the lock with my knife and some heavy furniture, creating a makeshift barricade. My hands trembled slightly, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a branch, every gust of wind against the walls, sent me sitting upright in bed, heart racing. The shadows outside seemed closer, and I felt the cabin's walls pressing in around me. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, listening for any sound of movement. I considered calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and the thought of leaving the cabin in the dark unsettled me. On the third day, I decided I couldn't stay put. The sense of danger had become too real, too suffocating. I packed everything I could into my backpack, double-checking that I had water, food, and my knife. I planned to leave at first light and head back to the main road, sticking to the trail I had marked the first day. My sleep was fitful, filled with half-formed dreams of someone entering the cabin, and I woke several times to the sound of the wind and distant snapping branches. Before dawn, I slipped quietly out of the cabin. The forest was thick with mist, and visibility was low. I stuck to the trail as best as I could, moving cautiously but quickly. Hours passed, and the mist began to lift. I felt increasingly tense with every step, checking over my shoulder constantly. The trail was harder to follow in some parts, overgrown and obscured by fallen trees. My energy was waning, and the backpack felt heavier with each passing mile. Around midday, I finally saw the edge of the forest and a stretch of the main road in the distance. Relief flooded through me, but I remained cautious. I broke into a run, knowing that any pause could be dangerous. As I neared the road, I finally saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed to a stop. I climbed in, exhausted, shaking, and explained as best I could that I had been alone in the woods and something had made me fear for my life. The driver listened quietly and offered to take me to the nearest police station, which I accepted without hesitation. At the station, I filed a report. They noted the broken door lock and advised me that someone may have entered the cabin while I was exploring. But without evidence, it was impossible to prove. I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. The experience had left me hyper-aware of my surroundings and deeply cautious, but I was alive, and I had made it back safely. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with authorities to investigate. The door had indeed been forced, and there were signs someone had moved around inside. Nothing valuable had been taken, suggesting perhaps the intruder was looking for shelter rather than stealing. It was a chilling reminder that isolation in the wilderness carries real risks. I never went back to that cabin, and I avoided traveling alone in remote areas after that. But the experience taught me the importance of preparation, vigilance, and respecting the unknown hazards of even seemingly quiet, peaceful places. The forest that once seemed inviting and serene had become a place I would never see in the same light. The memory of those tense nights, the oppressive quiet, and the ever-present sense of being watched stayed with me. Yet, the clarity of surviving it, of making careful choices under pressure, gave me a strange sense of strength. I had faced fear in a very real, very human form, and I had come through. The ending was not magical or comforting. It was the reality of survival. And in that reality, I found a lasting lesson. Preparation, awareness, and resilience are sometimes the only things standing between safety and danger. I had been planning the trip for weeks, organizing everything down to the last detail. I wanted to escape the city, to get away from the noise, from the people, from the constant buzz of life that seemed to never stop. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forest, far enough that cell service was unreliable, far enough that I wouldn't see another human for days if I didn't want to. The promise of isolation, of complete solitude, had been what drew me there. The thought of quiet mornings with nothing but the sun rising over the treetops, the smell of damp earth, and the crisp, clean air of the woods filled me with an almost foolish excitement. I drove for hours, the asphalt slowly turning into gravel, and then into dirt roads barely wide enough for one vehicle. The forest grew denser as I went deeper, the trees rising high like silent sentinels. The sunlight slanted through their branches in thin golden lines, and the air had that particular forest smell: wet wood, moss, decaying leaves, and pine. It was beautiful, but there was an unease in it I couldn't shake, the kind that creeps up slowly and lodges itself in your chest. The cabin itself was small, nothing more than a single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof. It had a front porch, a few steps leading up to it, and a weathered wooden door. The windows were dusty, but I could see inside. The interior was rustic, simple furniture, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a table with a few chairs, a bed in the corner, and a tiny bathroom. It smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but clean enough that I felt comfortable. The landlord had said that someone cleaned it before I arrived, but the forest air had a way of making everything smell damp and musty within hours. I spent the first few hours unpacking, arranging things, and making the cabin feel like it belonged to me for the week. I lit the stove, set up the few essentials I had brought, and sat on the porch watching the forest. Birds moved in the trees, small creatures rustled in the underbrush, and the sunlight danced on the leaves. It was peaceful, almost perfect. As evening approached, I built a fire in the small metal fire pit outside. I had brought wood with me, but I also found some dry logs in a nearby stack left by the previous tenants. The flames crackled, the orange glow casting long shadows across the cabin walls and the trees beyond. I sat there for hours, staring into the fire, letting the quiet settle over me. I felt completely alone, and for the first time in a long while, that solitude was comforting. Night fell slowly, the sky darkening to a deep, velvety black. The stars came out one by one, scattered across the sky like tiny pinpricks of light. I went inside and closed the shutters, feeling the warmth of the fire fading behind me. The cabin felt smaller at night, the shadows stretching across the walls, the wooden floor creaking with each step. I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the unpacking. It was around midnight that the first sound woke me. At first, I thought it was the wind, rustling branches, the occasional snapping of a twig. But then I heard it again, closer this time, deliberate. A heavy thump against the cabin wall. My heart jumped. I lay still, listening, telling myself it was probably an animal. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear. But the thumps continued, irregular, deliberate. Not something an animal would do. I stayed in bed, frozen, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. I didn't want to look, didn't want to move, but curiosity and fear mingled in a way that made it impossible to ignore. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound, and looked out into the darkness. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting only a faint red glow. The forest looked calm, still, but then I saw it. A figure moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. Human-shaped, tall, crouching slightly. I blinked, thinking I was imagining it, but it was still there, watching. I retreated to the bed, my mind racing. I had told myself no one else was in the forest, that I had this place entirely to myself. But something had changed. I could hear more sounds now, faint crunching of leaves, something scraping against the cabin wall. I thought about running to the car, but it was parked a short distance away, and I didn't want to be caught outside. I had brought no weapons, no way to defend myself beyond my own hands. The next morning, I woke with a dry mouth, a pounding head, and exhaustion weighing me down. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, a nightmare fueled by isolation. But then I noticed the marks on the cabin wall. Scratches, deep and jagged, as if someone had used a knife or a tool. My stomach sank. This wasn't a dream. Someone had been here, or was still here. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I pushed furniture in front of the door, collected more firewood, and made sure everything I needed was inside. I didn't leave the cabin for anything. I sat inside, listening to the wind in the trees, the occasional bird, trying to convince myself it was safe. But every little sound made me jump. I barely ate, barely slept. The isolation I had sought now felt like a trap. By the third day, I realized I couldn't just hide. Whoever or whatever was out there could be waiting for me to let my guard down. I had to get out. But the road back was miles of dirt paths through dense forest. If someone was stalking me, I would be vulnerable on the road. I decided to wait until nightfall, hoping that under the cover of darkness, I could move quietly, stay low, and avoid detection. When night came, I prepared. I gathered my backpack, filled it with water, food, a flashlight, and anything else I could grab quickly. I carried the keys to the car in my hand, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, controlling my panic. I waited until the forest was silent, or at least as silent as it could be, and then I opened the door. The air was cold and damp, smelling of moss and soil. The trees seemed taller, more oppressive in the dark. I moved slowly, sticking to shadows, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me freeze. I could hear something moving ahead, footsteps, light but deliberate. I ducked behind a tree, holding my breath, waiting. The sound passed. I moved again. I kept this up for what felt like hours, moving cautiously, pausing whenever I thought I heard someone. Finally, I saw the headlights of my car in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Relief flooded me, but I couldn't celebrate yet. I had to get there without being seen. I ran, ducking and weaving through the trees, my heart hammering. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept going. When I finally reached the car, I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the forest behind me, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I saw the figure standing among the trees, watching me. But then it was gone. I drove as fast as the dirt roads would allow, every nerve on edge, glancing at the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The drive back to civilization was tense. Every sound, every shadow made me flinch, When I finally reached a gas station on the main road, I stopped, locked the doors, and sat there shaking, trying to calm down. I called the police, reported the cabin, the marks, the figure I had seen. They said they would send someone to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't understand what it was like to feel truly hunted, to feel completely exposed in the forest with no one to help. I never went back to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, the memory of the figure in the darkness, the sound of scraping and thumping against the walls, the fear that had gripped me so completely. I had gone seeking solitude and found danger instead. But I had survived, and that survival, the careful planning, the focus, the refusal to panic, became something I carried with me. I knew I had learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to every detail, every sound, every shadow. And though I would never return to that cabin, I knew that facing the fear head-on had given me something no quiet morning or peaceful forest could. The knowledge that I could endure, that I could survive, and that I could come out the other side with my mind and body intact. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a few days alone in a small cabin deep in the woods was supposed to be a break from my life in the city. I imagined fresh air, quiet mornings, the smell of pine and damp soil, and nights spent sitting by the fire with nothing but my thoughts. The cabin was a small wooden structure, off a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest. From the photos I had seen online, it looked charming, remote, and safe. I didn't consider that isolation could ever feel threatening. I thought I would feel free. The drive there was long. The highway gave way to smaller roads, which gave way to narrow dirt paths that bounced me around in my car as I drove slowly through the trees. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating flickering patterns on the road, and at first it felt peaceful. By the time I turned onto the final path leading to the cabin, the sky had darkened slightly. Shadows were growing long, and the air had a cold bite I hadn't expected for this time of year. My phone signal was spotty, cutting in and out, and I realized I wouldn't be able to rely on it until I reached the cabin. That thought made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as I had imagined. Small, made of weathered wood, surrounded by thick forest. The door creaked as I opened it, and inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. The furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. There was a stack of firewood nearby, neatly arranged. I dropped my bag and walked around, inspecting everything. The windows looked out onto the trees, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. I started a fire, sat back, and tried to relax. But as the night fell, a creeping unease settled over me. The forest outside became a dark wall, the shadows moving with the wind. I kept telling myself it was normal, that there was nothing to worry about. Yet, every small sound, the snap of a branch, the scrape of a tree against the cabin siding, made me tense. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, even though there was no logical reason to. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting toward the window, and my mind kept imagining shapes in the darkness. I eventually went to bed, though I didn't sleep well. Every few hours, I woke to the sounds of the night. The wind rustled the trees, and occasionally, something heavier shifted, perhaps a deer, perhaps something else. The isolation was beginning to get to me, making every sound sharper, more frightening. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved to see sunlight filtering through the window. The first day I spent walking around the nearby trails, taking in the forest, trying to remind myself that this was supposed to be peaceful. The woods were beautiful, but I began to notice signs of human presence. Oddly flattened patches of earth, broken branches, and what looked like footprints. They weren't mine. They didn't look recent, but seeing them made me feel like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I convinced myself it was just other hikers or hunters who passed through the area. That evening, as I prepared dinner on the stove, I noticed something odd. The door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. My heart raced and I walked around checking all the windows. Everything else was secure. I closed the door, triple-checked the lock, and decided to ignore it, blaming the wind. But sleep was impossible that night. Every sound was amplified. The groan of the cabin settling, the whistling of wind through the trees, something scraping lightly against the outside wall. I tried to focus on breathing calmly, telling myself I was imagining things. On the third day, my unease deepened. I woke to the sound of something moving outside. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, then louder, a thud, then another, as if something was walking around the cabin. My mind raced. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest town was miles away, and my car was parked at the edge of the property. I waited quietly, listening. Eventually, the sounds stopped, but the memory of them lingered. I began checking the perimeter of the cabin during the day, noticing subtle signs. Footprints in the dirt, small branches broken at odd angles, and a feeling that I was being watched. I spent the fourth day trying to convince myself I was just stressed and imagining things. I explored more of the surrounding forest, taking careful note of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. The further I went, the more I felt that the forest was familiar in ways that didn't make sense. Fallen trees in the same patterns, paths that seemed repeated, and the faint impression that someone had been moving through these woods recently. By nightfall, the unease had escalated into outright fear. That night, I woke to a series of knocks on the door. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I stayed still, straining to listen. The knock stopped, then started again, louder. I realized someone had come near the cabin. My first instinct was to run, but I was deep in the woods with no clear path. My second instinct was to hide. I grabbed a large kitchen knife from the counter and crouched near the bed, waiting. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed. I told myself it was an animal, but the sound had been deliberate, too regular to be a deer or a raccoon. Sleep didn't come that night. At first light, I opened the door cautiously. Nothing was there. No footprints. No sign of anyone. My relief was temporary. Over the next day, I noticed signs of repeated human activity around the cabin. More footprints, small disturbances in the dirt, and the faint smell of smoke somewhere downwind, as if someone had made a small fire. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think logically. I could survive if I stayed alert and made a careful plan. I spent the fifth day preparing for a possible confrontation. I reinforced the door as best I could, making it harder to open. I gathered heavy sticks and stones from outside and positioned them near the windows. I kept my knife close. I scouted the perimeter several times, noting likely hiding spots where someone could approach unnoticed. I realized I had no idea why anyone would be here or whether they were dangerous, but I knew I had to be ready. Night came again, and with it, more sounds. Footsteps circling the cabin. The occasional thud against the wall. I could hear breathing, faint and uneven. My heart pounded, but I stayed silent, barely daring to move. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Just before dawn, I heard a sound that made me jump. The door handle rattling. Someone was trying to open the door. I held my knife tight, ready. After a moment, the rattling stopped. Silence returned. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. Morning brought no comfort. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I gathered my things, trying to move quietly in case anyone was outside. I walked quickly to my car, eyes scanning constantly. When I reached it, I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine. The moment the car roared to life, I felt a rush of relief. I drove away as fast as the dirt road allowed, glancing in the rearview mirror constantly. For the first hour, the forest seemed empty, quiet. I tried to convince myself I had imagined most of it, that my fear had made shadows seem threatening. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing among the trees by the side of the road. It didn't move, just watched. My stomach churned. I sped up, and it didn't follow. I didn't look back. By the time I reached a town and finally saw other people, I felt the tension start to leave my body. I called the authorities, explained the situation, and they reassured me that no one else was reported missing or nearby. Still, the experience had left its mark. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods weren't empty, that someone had been close enough to touch the cabin walls. In the following weeks, I tried to put it behind me, but the fear lingered. I realized how easy it would have been for someone to hurt me if they had wanted to, and how unprepared I had been. I learned to be wary, to trust my instincts, and to respect the isolation of the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin. The memories stayed vivid. The sounds at night, the feeling of being watched, the cold dread of realizing how alone I really was. But over time, I also recognized something else. I had survived. I had stayed calm enough to protect myself, to leave safely, and to seek help. I learned to notice details, to anticipate danger, and to respect my own limits. The experience taught me that fear is real, tangible, and sometimes unavoidable, but survival depends on staying alert, thinking clearly, and acting decisively. Years later, when I drive past dense forests or isolated cabins, the memory returns in a rush. I remember the dark nights, the uncertain footsteps, and the silent figure among the trees. But I also remember the feeling of reaching safety, the relief of driving back into civilization, and the lesson that even in the most terrifying moments, careful observation, calm thinking, and decisive action can keep you alive. The cabin remains in my memory not as a haunted place, but as a stark reminder of how unpredictable the world can be, and how resilience, preparation, and courage can carry you through even the most frightening situations. I had been planning the trip for months, not because I was particularly adventurous, but because I needed a break from everything. The city had become too crowded, too loud, and too demanding. Work was relentless. The constant notifications, emails, and phone calls felt like weights pressing on my chest, and I realized that I had lost the sense of calm I once had. The idea of escaping into the woods, far from the constant hum of the city, was appealing in a way that I hadn't felt in years. I had rented a small cabin through an online listing. It was simple, isolated, and a little worn, but it had a charm I couldn't resist. From the pictures, it looked like it had been there for decades, nestled at the edge of a dense forest, with a small clearing around it that let in sunlight during the day. The porch looked rough but sturdy, and the chimney promised a fire I could light in the evenings. I imagined myself sitting there, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, the wind rustling the leaves, and nothing else in the world matching. The drive out there was long and winding. I had to take small, unmarked roads, and at some points I doubted the GPS entirely. The car's tires crunched over gravel and dirt paths that had clearly not seen heavy traffic in years. Every so often, I would pass signs warning of steep drops, or that the road was unsafe during rain, which made me more alert, though I didn't have any reason to turn back. There was a thrill in the uncertainty, and I told myself it was part of the experience. When I finally arrived, the cabin was just as it had appeared in the photos, though the isolation hit me harder in person. The forest seemed endless on all sides, the trees dense and tall, their branches tangled so that sunlight barely reached the ground beyond the clearing. I parked the car on the small patch of flat ground in front of the cabin, grabbed my bags, and unlocked the front door. The cabin smelled of old wood, a mixture of dust and something faintly earthy, like the smell of leaves left in the rain for too long. It was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing. Only the faint creak of the cabin itself as it settled and the occasional whisper of the wind. Inside, the cabin was basic but functional. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove and a tiny refrigerator, a living area with a sagging couch and a few old chairs, and a single bedroom with a bed covered in a thick quilt that looked worn but clean. There was a stack of firewood beside the fireplace, which I found comforting, and a small table with a lamp and a few candles. I unpacked my things slowly, taking in every detail of the cabin and the forest beyond the windows. Even in the daylight, the woods felt dense, almost suffocating, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. That evening, I made a small fire in the fireplace and cooked a simple meal, listening to the fire crackle and the wind brush against the cabin walls. As the light faded, the forest outside darkened rapidly, and the shadows seemed to press closer against the windows. It was beautiful, but it was also unsettling. I told myself it was normal to feel uneasy in a place I had never been, surrounded by trees that obscured everything beyond a few feet. I double-checked the doors and windows before heading to bed, feeling a slight chill in the air despite the fire. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that immediately set my heart racing. It was faint at first, almost like a distant footstep, but it was deliberate, steady, and coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time, and then another, like someone was walking slowly around the perimeter. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match anything I knew. They were heavy and careful, as if whoever or whatever it was testing the ground before taking each step. I reached for my phone to check the time, my hands trembling, but there was no signal. I reminded myself that I was isolated for a reason. The cell towers didn't reach here. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. Maybe it was someone lost, someone camping in the woods. I had seen that happen before. Maybe they needed help. But deep down, a small, persistent voice told me it was something else, something I couldn't quite name. I got up and quietly grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Holding it tightly, I walked to the window and peeked out. The night was black, the forest a wall of darkness. I could see the outlines of the trees swaying in the wind, but there was nothing there. The steps had stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, every creak of the cabin amplified in the silence. Suddenly, I heard a thud, very close, like someone had dropped a heavy object. My breath caught, and I almost dropped the flashlight. I moved to the door, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my weight. I had the flashlight in one hand and a heavy cast iron skillet in the other. I opened the door just a crack, shining the light into the darkness. Nothing, only the shadows of the trees shifting, the wind carrying the sound of distant branches snapping. I took a step outside. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that made your lungs ache after a few breaths. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. A figure, crouched just beyond the clearing, barely visible in the weak moonlight filtering through the branches. It didn't move, but I could sense it watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the flashlight toward it, but it vanished. Just like that, nothing. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. Every instinct screamed at me to get back inside, lock the door, and not leave until daylight. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, sitting as close to the fireplace as possible, holding the skillet in my lap, listening to every small sound outside. The wind howled, branches scraped against the roof, and occasionally I thought I heard footsteps, always distant, always fading when I strained to locate them. I didn't sleep, couldn't. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, my eyes bloodshot, my body tense. Morning brought a semblance of relief. The forest looked peaceful, bathed in soft light, the shadows retreating. I told myself the events of the night were probably just my imagination, fueled by isolation and fear. I needed food, water, and rest, so I tried to relax, unpacked more supplies, and did my best to eat. But even in the daylight, the forest felt oppressive. It was too dense, too silent, and too isolated. Every movement, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I explored the surrounding area cautiously. The clearing around the cabin extended a few dozen feet before giving way to dense underbrush. I noticed fresh tracks in the soft earth, large footprints that weren't human. They were deep, heavy, and led around the cabin in circles. I followed them carefully, flashlight in hand despite the light of day, realizing that the prints suggested someone, or something, had been moving around the cabin all night. I traced them for a while before deciding it was too risky to go further. That evening, I decided I couldn't stay inside the cabin any longer. I needed to check the perimeter properly, to understand what I was dealing with. I packed a small backpack with essentials: water, food, flashlight, knife, and a lighter. I tied the skillet to the strap, just in case. The air was cold again, heavier than before, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my pulse spike. As I circled the cabin, I noticed signs that someone had been there. Footprints, broken branches, and small piles of debris that suggested attempts at concealment. Whoever or whatever had been moving around the cabin was careful, experienced, and patient. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with chance or wildlife. This was something deliberate, someone testing my presence. Fear, sharp and immediate, surged through me. By the third night, I had fortified the cabin as best as I could. Windows were secured with whatever furniture I could move, the doors reinforced with wooden planks, and the fire kept alive to provide light and warmth. I hardly ate, hardly slept, and every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I couldn't call for help. There was no signal. I couldn't leave. The roads were too remote, the forest too thick, and the sun was setting earlier each day. I had always believed that isolation could be a kind of therapy. The city, with its constant hum of traffic, endless lights, and the relentless pace of life, had begun to weigh on me. I decided to rent a small cabin far from any town or road, deep in the forest, where the only sounds would be those of wind brushing through the pines and the occasional call of distant birds. It was the middle of autumn, and the air already carried that sharp bite of winter, carrying the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. I told myself it would be a week of solitude, a week to rest, to clear my mind, and to live simply without the constant intrusions of the modern world. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, built mostly of pine logs. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living space with a wood stove in the corner. Outside, there was a tiny deck, overlooking a clearing in the forest. I parked my car at the edge of the small dirt path that led to the cabin, hauled in my supplies, and started settling in. The place had no electricity, no internet, and only a well for water, which I tested and found clean enough to drink. The lack of modern comforts was supposed to be part of the experience, but as I unpacked, I felt a small prickle of unease. Being alone was one thing, but being completely cut off, knowing that if something went wrong no one would be there for hours, made my stomach twist. The first night was peaceful, in a strange, almost deceptive way. I lit a fire in the stove, the smell of burning pine filling the small cabin. Shadows from the flickering flames danced along the walls. I had brought a few books, a notebook, and a small lantern, and I spent hours writing and reading. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and occasionally I thought I heard twigs snapping in the distance, but I told myself it was just deer or small animals moving through the undergrowth. The quiet was profound, almost tangible. I went to bed early, the warmth of the stove keeping the cabin tolerable despite the cold outside. The second day was colder than the first. Frost coated the edges of the windows, and the well water was nearly frozen. I had planned to take a walk in the woods, to explore, but when I stepped outside, the forest felt heavier, darker. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks rough and imposing, and the canopy above filtered the light in a way that made everything below seem dim. I walked carefully, sticking to the paths I could make out from the dirt and fallen leaves. I carried a small hatchet and a flashlight, more out of habit than real fear. After a few hours, I returned to the cabin, tired, and lit the stove again. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, the way the forest seemed too still whenever I paused. At night, the wind grew stronger, rattling the cabin in a way that made every creak and groan of the structure seem like it was alive. On the third day, I discovered something that unsettled me. While collecting firewood near the back of the cabin, I found footprints in the soft soil. At first, I thought they were animal prints, deer perhaps, but they were too large, too human-like. I traced them back toward the forest edge and realized they led away from the cabin, toward the deeper woods, where no trail existed. I couldn't see where they ended. I felt a twinge of fear and told myself that someone else must have a cabin nearby, maybe hunters or hikers. Still, a small knot of worry grew in my stomach. I returned to the cabin quickly and double-checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The forest outside seemed darker now, more oppressive. By the fourth day, the unease had started to gnaw at me constantly. Each night, The wind seemed to carry sounds that weren't there in the day. Branches snapped just beyond the reach of the porch light. Sometimes I could swear I saw movement in the shadows between the trees, but whenever I focused on it, it was gone. I kept the doors locked and the windows closed, the fire burning high. I rationed my food carefully and tried to keep my mind occupied with writing and chores, but sleep became difficult. Every noise startled me. Every small creak of the cabin felt like a warning. My imagination, which had been quiet in the city's chaos, now ran wild with possibilities I didn't want to consider. On the 5th day, I ventured further into the forest than I had before, hoping that movement and exploration would help clear my mind. I walked for hours, noticing the minute details, the way the light shifted between the trees, the odd smell of damp earth mixed with decaying leaves, the constant scratching and rustling of unseen creatures. I found no one, and yet the footprints I had seen earlier lingered in my mind. Returning to the cabin as dusk approached, I realized that the forest had changed. The familiar paths seemed less clear, and I had to mark trees to find my way back. As I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sight of it brought a mix of relief and dread. It seemed smaller somehow, more fragile. The idea that I was completely alone, truly at the mercy of the environment and perhaps other people, pressed down on me heavily. That night, sleep almost eluded me. I lay on the small bed, listening to the wind battering the walls, imagining shapes moving just beyond the glass. I kept the lantern burning beside me and the axe near the door. The sound of twigs snapping outside was frequent, closer now than before. At one point, I thought I heard soft footsteps circling the cabin. My heart raced. I stayed absolutely still, listening, straining to catch any sign that I had imagined it. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep, waking constantly to the noises outside. The 6th day was the breaking point. I awoke to a strange silence, the kind that is heavier than wind or rain. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I went to the window and noticed more footprints near the cabin, larger and clearer than the ones before. They surrounded the cabin now, approaching from all sides. Panic surged through me. I gathered all my belongings quickly, making a mental plan to leave immediately if needed. The thought of walking out through the forest, unseen and unprepared for what, or who, might be there terrified me. I had to calm myself, think rationally. I checked the well, the stove, everything that could be essential for survival. It was becoming increasingly clear that staying inside, locked up, might not be enough. I spent the next several hours preparing. I fortified the doors and windows with heavy furniture, gathered enough firewood to keep the stove going all night, and kept my axe within reach. I also prepared a small pack with essentials, water, food, my notebook, flashlight, and first aid supplies, ready to leave at a moment's notice. The shadows outside shifted as the day wore on, and I realized that staying put required constant vigilance. I had to know exactly where every sound came from to differentiate between wildlife and the possibility of a human presence. That evening, the wind picked up to a near gale. Trees bent and groaned, and rain began to fall in sheets. I watched the clearing outside, my heart pounding at every movement. The footprints were still visible, distorted slightly by the rain, but they were there. Someone or something had been circling the cabin. I realized I could not stay here another night without risking confrontation. I made a decision. At first light, I would leave and take the path back to the main road, regardless of what I found along the way. The night was restless and frightening. Every crash of a branch or distant roar of an animal felt like a direct threat. I barely slept, sitting by the stove and keeping the axe in my hands. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a damp, misty forest. I packed my essentials quickly, checked every corner of the cabin once more, and stepped outside. The footprints from the night before were clear now in the muddy soil, leading toward the forest edge. I walked cautiously, staying on the path I had made, moving fast enough to stay ahead but slow enough to remain aware of my surroundings. After hours of careful walking, navigating the slippery forest floor, and staying alert for signs of anyone following, I finally reached the dirt road that led back to civilization. The sight of my car brought an overwhelming relief. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I reached the nearest town. The tension that had gripped me for days only began to release when I finally parked near a gas station. The hum of human activity surrounding me. I realized that while the forest offered isolation and beauty, it also carried unpredictability and danger I had underestimated. Looking back, I understood that my fear had been both rational and exaggerated by isolation. No one had tried to harm me, but the footprints, the unknown presence, and the sheer solitude had made every sound a threat. I had survived by preparing, staying alert, and trusting my instincts. The cabin had been beautiful and serene by day, but at night, it was a reminder that even in a quiet place, danger can be real and constant. I returned home with a renewed respect for the wilderness and the knowledge that solitude, while tempting, carries risks that must never be ignored. I had planned this trip for months, maybe too long, because by the time I actually got there, I was restless in a way I hadn't felt in years. I had chosen a small cabin deep in the woods, off a dirt road that hardly showed up on maps. I wanted solitude, a place to think, away from the noise of city life, the constant pressure, the endless notifications. The cabin was advertised online as isolated but cozy, with electricity and a small propane heater. The pictures showed wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a small deck overlooking a creek. It seemed perfect. The drive there was longer than I expected. The first couple of hours were through normal roads, small towns, gas stations that were mostly empty. I filled up the tank just in case and stocked up on snacks. Then the asphalt ended and the road narrowed to gravel, and eventually it became a dirt track that wound through dense pine trees. By the time I turned onto the last stretch leading to the cabin, the sun was already low, bleeding golden light through the trees, making the forest look both inviting and unnervingly endless. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as the car rattled over hidden rocks, the tires crunching against loose stones. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I was leaving behind the familiar world. I arrived just as the sun touched the horizon. The cabin was exactly like the photos, maybe even better, with planks darkened with age, moss growing on the roof, the chimney slightly crooked but solid. There was a small clearing around it, maybe 30 feet in every direction, surrounded by tall pines and oaks that blocked most of the fading light. I parked, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the front door. The air smelled sharp, a mix of pine, wet soil, and something metallic, like iron from the creek nearby. I put the key in, turned it, and the door opened with a soft creak. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood and something faintly musty, a smell of old blankets and fire smoke. There was a small living area with a couch, a couple of chairs, and a low table. A wood stove sat in the corner, and a pile of firewood rested against the wall. A narrow hallway led to a tiny kitchen with a propane stove, a sink, and a fridge that hummed quietly. At the back was a bedroom, a simple bed with thick blankets, and a small bathroom with a shower. Everything was dusty but clean, like someone had left it untouched for years. I unpacked quickly, throwing my bags on the bed, setting up a few essentials. I had brought a lantern, matches, and extra blankets, though I didn't think I would need them yet. It was late, but I lit the stove to take the chill off and made a small dinner, just some canned soup heated over the flame. As I ate, I watched the last of the light slip through the windows, shadows crawling along the walls. Even then, I felt it, a heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that pressed against me, not threatening exactly, but making me hyper-aware. After cleaning up, I went to the deck and stepped outside. The creek below was just visible, water moving slowly over rocks, glinting faintly in the twilight. Birds were quiet now, the usual evening chorus gone, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howl of some animal, maybe a coyote. I stayed out there until darkness fully fell, leaning against the railing, feeling the chill creep into my bones. Night arrived fully, and with it, a silence so complete it was almost loud. I turned on the lantern inside and sat on the couch, trying to read a book, but my mind wouldn't settle. Every small sound, the wind shaking the trees, a branch snapping somewhere far off, the creek's water brushing over stones, made me tense. Hours passed, and I realized I hadn't heard a single car, not even in the distance. The cabin was isolated. I was completely alone. I tried to sleep, but the bed felt too small, too unfamiliar. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the old wood groan. I imagined things, figures moving outside, shadows passing between the trees, but I kept reminding myself I was alone. Still, every time I thought I heard a footstep on the deck, I froze, heart thumping. Around midnight, I finally decided to check the doors and windows. Every lock was secure, the windows closed, nothing was disturbed. I tried to settle back in bed, but that constant feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't explain it logically. The forest was alive, yes, but I had been hiking and camping before. I knew the sounds of wildlife. Yet something about the cabin, about being alone in a place where no one else would come for miles, made every noise feel deliberate. That night, I woke to a series of knocks on the door. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I stayed still, straining to listen. The knock stopped, then started again, louder. I realized someone had come near the cabin. My first instinct was to run, but I was deep in the woods with no clear path. My second instinct was to hide. I grabbed a large kitchen knife from the counter and crouched near the bed, waiting. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed. I told myself it was an animal, but the sound had been deliberate, too regular to be a deer or a raccoon. Sleep didn't come that night. At first light, I opened the door cautiously. Nothing was there. No footprints, no sign of anyone. My relief was temporary. Over the next day, I noticed signs of repeated human activity around the cabin. More footprints, small disturbances in the dirt, and the faint smell of smoke somewhere downwind, as if someone had made a small fire. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think logically. I could survive if I stayed alert and made a careful plan. I spent the 5th day preparing for a possible confrontation. I reinforced the door as best I could, making it harder to open. I gathered heavy sticks and stones from outside and positioned them near the windows. I kept my knife close. I scouted the perimeter several times, noting likely hiding spots where someone could approach unnoticed. I realized I had no idea why anyone would be here or whether they were dangerous, but I knew I had to be ready. Night came again, and with it, more sounds. Footsteps circling the cabin. The occasional thud against the wall. I could hear breathing, faint and uneven. My heart pounded, but I stayed silent, barely daring to move. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Just before dawn, I heard a sound that made me jump. The door handle rattling. Someone was trying to open the door. I held my knife tight, ready. After a moment, the rattling stopped. Silence returned. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. Morning brought no comfort. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I gathered my things, trying to move quietly in case anyone was outside. I walked quickly to my car, eyes scanning constantly. When I reached it, I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine. The moment the car roared to life, I felt a rush of relief. I drove away as fast as the dirt road allowed, glancing in the rearview mirror constantly. For the first hour, the forest seemed empty, quiet. I tried to convince myself I had imagined most of it, that my fear had made shadows seem threatening. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing among the trees by the side of the road. Didn't move, just watched. My stomach churned. I sped up, and it didn't follow. I didn't look back. By the time I reached a town and finally saw other people, I felt the tension start to leave my body. I called the authorities, explained the situation, and they reassured me that no one else was reported missing or nearby. Still, the experience had left its mark. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods weren't empty, that someone had been close enough to touch the cabin walls. In the following weeks, I tried to put it behind me, but the fear lingered. I realized how easy it would have been for someone to hurt me if they had wanted to, and how unprepared I had been. I learned to be wary, to trust my instincts, and to respect the isolation of the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin. The memories stayed vivid. The sounds at night, the feeling of being watched, the cold dread of realizing how alone I really was. But over time, I also recognized something else. I had survived. I had stayed calm enough to protect myself, to leave safely, and to seek help. I learned to notice details, to anticipate danger, and to respect my own limits. The experience taught me that fear is real, tangible, and sometimes unavoidable, but survival depends on staying alert, thinking clearly, and acting decisively. Years later, when I drive past dense forests or isolated cabins, the memory returns in a rush. I remember the dark nights, the uncertain footsteps, and the silent figure among the trees. But I also remember the feeling of reaching safety, the relief of driving back into civilization, and the lesson that even in the most terrifying moments, careful observation, calm thinking, and decisive action can keep you alive. The cabin remains in my memory not as a haunted place, but as a stark reminder of how unpredictable the world can be, and how resilience, preparation, and courage can carry you through even the most frightening situations. I remember the first time I decided to rent a cabin deep in the forest. It was in late October, when the air had begun to carry a sharp, early winter bite. I had wanted to escape the city, the endless hum of traffic, the glare of screens, and the pressure of constant human presence. I had scouted a small wooden cabin through a rental site. It was described as secluded, rustic, and peaceful, nestled at the edge of a dense pine forest, next to a small, slow-moving creek. The photos showed a worn but sturdy cabin, with a stone chimney, a small porch, and moss-covered wooden walls. There was no cell phone reception, and the rental owner assured me that I would find the nearest convenience store nearly an hour away by dirt road. That was precisely what I wanted. Isolation. I packed the car carefully, making sure to include enough firewood, canned food, water, and all the usual survival gear. I brought a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a hand crank emergency radio, a map of the surrounding area, and a large knife that I had inherited from my grandfather. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, not even my closest friends. The idea of total solitude was intoxicating. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The paved road eventually turned into gravel, then dirt, and finally a narrow path barely wide enough for my small SUV. Tall pines rose like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sunlight had begun to fade, filtered through the dense branches, creating long, slanting shadows across the road. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped completely, leaving the forest in a cold, bluish darkness. The cabin looked exactly as it had in the photos. The wooden steps to the porch creaked under my weight as I set down my bags. I fumbled with the key the owner had left in a hidden lockbox, finally managing to open the heavy door. The interior smelled of old wood and faint smoke. Dust particles floated lazily in the thin beams of my flashlight. The cabin was small but functional, with a living area, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a single bedroom. There was a wood-burning stove in the living area, which I immediately set to lighting. I unpacked my supplies and stacked the firewood next to the stove. Then I cooked a small meal, using the canned food I had brought, and ate slowly, listening to the occasional creaks and groans of the cabin settling into the cold night. The wind rattled the windows at times, and every so often I thought I heard the faint sound of branches snapping outside, though I couldn't tell if it was animals or just the wind. The first night passed relatively uneventfully, though I woke several times to the sound of something scratching lightly at the walls outside. I had assumed it was a deer or a raccoon, though part of me knew that the forest could hide far more dangerous animals. I stayed up later than usual, checking my supplies, double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, making sure nothing was left that could attract wildlife. By the time I finally lay down, the fire had died to glowing embers, and the cabin was silent again except for the occasional creak. The next morning, I went outside to explore a little. The forest was dense and quiet, with only the occasional bird call or rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I followed a narrow path along the creek, trying not to slip on the wet leaves. As I walked, I noticed signs that someone had passed through recently. Footprints, faint and partially obscured by leaves, appeared near the creek and continued into the woods. At first, I assumed they were hikers, though I hadn't seen anyone else around. A small part of me felt uneasy, but I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was probably just hunters or hikers passing through earlier in the week. As the day wore on, I spent time chopping more firewood, cleaning the cabin, and organizing my supplies. The air was chilly, and the forest seemed alive in subtle ways. The crack of twigs underfoot, the distant calls of birds, the way the wind moved through the trees. By late afternoon, a sense of isolation had begun to settle on me. I was alone, truly alone, and it was both exhilarating and unnerving. That evening, I cooked another meal and tried to relax by the fire. But the scratching at the cabin returned, louder this time, more persistent. I went to the window and shined my flashlight outside. The forest seemed empty. No movement, no eyes reflecting in the light. I told myself it was nothing, but my heart was racing. I double-checked the doors, secured the windows, and even placed my knife on the table next to me. The fire crackled and popped, filling the room with warmth and light, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I heard something different. A low, dragging sound coming from the back of the cabin. Not a deer, not a raccoon. Something heavier, something that made the boards underfoot groan. I froze, listening. The sound moved slowly along the side of the cabin, then stopped. I held my breath. After a few minutes, nothing. I convinced myself it was the wind or maybe a fallen branch, but sleep was impossible. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, sitting near the fire with my knife in hand. The next morning, I found marks on the side of the cabin. Scratches in the wood, deep and jagged, as though something had tried to get in. The sight made my stomach twist. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and the road had become slick with overnight rain. I spent the morning repairing the damage as best I could, hammering boards over the marks and reinforcing the door frame. I also started noticing other signs. My food supplies had shifted, even though I had not touched them. Small pieces of clothing or personal items I had left out seemed slightly moved. My rational mind told me it was the wind, or maybe a bird or small animal, but the feeling of being watched was growing. Every time I looked out the window, I thought I saw movement just beyond the trees. Always just out of clear sight, always gone when I focused on it. By the third night, I realized that staying in the cabin might be more dangerous than I had initially thought. I debated leaving, but a combination of stubbornness and the knowledge that the weather had turned colder kept me inside. That night, the dragging sound returned, closer this time, circling the cabin as though the presence outside was deliberately pacing me. The scratches on the walls were louder, sharper, more frequent. I slept fitfully, waking at every sound. I began noticing small signs of a human presence outside. Footprints, some fresh, some older. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of someone, just a shadow moving between the trees. There was no pattern, no direct threat yet, but the knowledge that someone was out there, watching, waiting, was terrifying. I kept the fire going longer, built a barricade with furniture in front of the door, and kept my knife close at all times. The fourth day, I decided I needed to observe without being seen. I left the cabin briefly, walking carefully through the forest, following some of the tracks I had noticed earlier. They were fresh and human, sometimes paired with marks of heavy boots or even tire tracks from a small vehicle. Whoever it was had been near the cabin multiple times. I realized I was no longer in just isolation, I was being stalked. That evening, I prepared for the worst. I barricaded the cabin as much as I could, placing furniture against doors and windows, setting a small stockpile of firewood near the door in case I needed to defend myself. I also took my emergency radio and tuned it to the local police frequency, hoping to catch any chatter about people in the area. I could see that the sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, making the forest darker than usual. The dragging sound came again around midnight. This time, it was accompanied by muffled voices, or perhaps just the indistinct murmuring of people, but I could not be sure. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening as the presence moved around the cabin. My mind raced with possibilities. Burglars, trespassers, or even someone with far worse intentions. I stayed by the window, my flashlight off, peering into the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse. I saw a shadow, massive and deliberate, moving just beyond the tree line. By early morning, the presence had finally left. I ventured outside cautiously and found new marks on the ground. Clear signs that someone had been circling the cabin, inspecting the area, perhaps waiting for me to leave. I gathered my courage and made a decision. I would leave the cabin immediately and drive to the nearest town to report what had happened. Packing up was tense. I moved quietly, making sure not to leave any signs that I was aware of the stalker. I loaded my car, kept my knife on my lap, and started the engine. The drive out of the forest was slow and careful. Every turn of the narrow dirt path felt like it might conceal someone lying in wait, but I made it out without incident. When I finally reached the town, I went straight to the police station. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. The marks on the cabin, the sounds at night, the fresh tracks and evidence of human presence. The officers took my report seriously. A patrol was dispatched to the area to investigate. The rental owner later confirmed that no one had permission to be near the cabin and that previous renters had reported strange occurrences too, though no one had ever been harmed. In the days after, I stayed with a friend, too shaken to return home. I realized that while the cabin had offered peace and solitude, it had also exposed me to dangers I had not anticipated. The unpredictability of human behavior in isolation, and the vulnerability of being completely alone in a place with no immediate help. Weeks later, I returned with a small team of friends and security equipment to retrieve my remaining belongings from the cabin. We found the cabin intact but noted the same scratch marks and footprints I had seen before. Whoever had been stalking me had left, but the memory of those nights stayed with me. I never went back to the cabin alone, and I never again sought isolation in the forest without some form of protection or at least a way to call for help. I still think about those nights sometimes, the endless dark, the constant feeling of being watched, and the sounds that haunted the silence. It taught me a lot about fear, about caution, and about the hidden dangers that can exist in places that seem peaceful at first glance. Solitude can be beautiful, but in the wrong circumstances, it can be deadly. It began as a plan that I thought would be simple. I had spent weeks searching for a quiet spot far from the city, somewhere I could be alone and unwind. My work life had been relentless, filled with endless calls, meetings, and the constant hum of people demanding my attention. I needed silence. I wanted solitude. I found a small cabin listed online, tucked deep in the mountains, a place that promised isolation and the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The reviews were sparse, but positive, describing a place that had electricity, a wood stove, and an old well that provided fresh water. It sounded perfect. I didn't realize how wrong I would be about perfect. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. I left early in the morning, the streets of the city gradually giving way to open fields, then hills and finally dense forests. The road became narrower, cracked in places, and then turned into a rough dirt track. The sun was high in the sky when I finally spotted the cabin in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine and fir trees. It was small, with weathered wood that had darkened with age, but it had a charm about it that made me think I could spend a week here without regret. I parked the car and stepped out, breathing in the crisp mountain air. There was a faint smell of pine and damp earth. The forest was quiet except for the occasional sound of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I felt a flicker of unease, a tiny twinge that I pushed aside. That was normal, I told myself. I was in the wilderness, alone. The world I knew was behind me. The cabin door creaked as I opened it. Inside, it was simple. A small living area with a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a bed pushed into a corner, and shelves with a few basic kitchen items. Dust coated some surfaces, but nothing seemed broken. I set my backpack down and began exploring. The electricity worked, and there was a small bathroom with running water. The place had been empty for a while, but it seemed safe. I decided to make a fire in the stove. I gathered some dry wood that had been stacked near the cabin and managed to get the flames going after a few failed attempts. The warmth filled the room, and I started to feel a little more at ease. I unpacked my things slowly, taking my time to settle in. I had brought food, a small supply of water, extra blankets, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I was prepared, or so I thought. The first night passed without incident. I went to bed early, lulled by the unfamiliar quiet and the subtle creaks of the cabin settling. I woke a few times during the night, listening to the wind in the trees, the distant calls of animals, but nothing alarming happened. It felt peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I packed a small backpack with water, a map, my phone, which had a weak signal, and some snacks. The trees were dense, and the terrain was rough. I followed what looked like an old trail at first, but it soon disappeared, leaving me to navigate between thick underbrush, rocks, and fallen branches. I reminded myself to stay aware, to mark my path as I went, and to return before dark. As I moved deeper into the forest, I began to notice signs of wildlife. Tracks in the dirt, broken branches, and the occasional rustle in the bushes. I kept my eyes peeled, knowing that bears and mountain lions could inhabit this area. It was thrilling in a way, the kind of raw, real feeling you get when you realize how small you are in a vast wilderness. Hours passed as I wandered, climbing small hills and descending into hollows. I found a stream that trickled down from higher ground, and I paused to refill my water bottle and take a short break. The water was cold and clean, and the quiet was nearly absolute. As evening approached, I realized I had wandered further than I intended. The forest had a way of disorienting me. Trees all looked similar, and paths I thought I recognized led to nowhere. I tried retracing my steps, but the sun was setting fast, and shadows grew long and deep. Panic started to creep in. I didn't have a compass, and my phone barely had a signal. I decided to climb a small hill, hoping to get a better view and maybe spot the cabin from above. From the top, I could see for a distance, but the dense forest made it impossible to identify the cabin. The sky was now painted in deep oranges and purples, and I realized I had made a dangerous mistake. I had no choice but to find a safe place to wait for morning. I spotted a small clearing nearby and decided to set up a temporary camp. I gathered some fallen branches and leaves, trying to make a small windbreak. I didn't have a tent, only my jacket and blanket, but it was better than nothing. At about 2 a.m., the noise started. Not outside exactly, but from the walls themselves. Soft thumps, like someone walking carefully across the floor above me. But there was no upstairs. Just the roof, the attic maybe, which I knew was empty. My stomach tightened. I tried to reason. Animals, squirrels, or raccoons in the attic. I had heard them in other cabins before, but the sound was too slow, too heavy, deliberate, and it wasn't random, it moved. Across the ceiling, from one side to the other, pausing occasionally, then continuing. I stayed frozen in bed, listening. Then came scratching, light at first, then heavier. Claws, I thought, or something trying to get through. My rational mind told me it had to be animals, but the pattern was too unusual, too intentional. I thought about leaving, but in the dark, navigating the dirt track was dangerous, and my car was several minutes walk away. I tried to stay calm, remembering my flashlight and my small camping knife in the kitchen drawer. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I watched the light of the lantern flicker as the wind rattled the windows. Occasionally, the scratching would stop, and I'd hold my breath, thinking I'd hear the next move. The sounds never stopped completely. They shifted, sometimes above, sometimes along the walls, sometimes faintly below. At one point, I heard a low thud on the deck outside, almost like someone had dropped something. My heart raced. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to sit and wait for whatever it was to find me. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, food, flashlight, knife, and quietly stepped outside. The forest was calm in daylight, deceptive in its normalcy. I walked to the car, keeping my eyes on the trees, listening carefully. Every shadow looked like movement. I drove slowly down the dirt road, constantly glancing in the mirrors, heart pounding. The nearest town was small, maybe 20 minutes away, and I stopped at a gas station just to calm down. I bought a coffee, something to eat, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Animals, wind, the old cabin settling, nothing more. But my instincts told me otherwise. That night in the cabin had been different. The way the sounds moved, the way I felt watched, it wasn't just imagination. I didn't stay to find out what exactly it was, and I realized I never would. After that, I never returned to that cabin. I researched the area, checked online forums, and found a few mentions of break-ins and wildlife issues. But no one seemed to report anything truly terrifying. Still, I knew the truth for myself. The cabin was isolated in a way that made it dangerous, not because of ghosts or legends, but because alone in a remote place, anything can become threatening. The woods are alive, and in the dark, even normal things can feel like something else entirely. I eventually bought a small camper and stuck to designated camping areas. The lesson stayed with me. The forest can be peaceful and beautiful, but it can also be unforgiving, unpredictable, and extremely lonely. There is safety in numbers, in light, and in being prepared. And I had learned that in the hardest way possible, through the fear of complete isolation, and the knowledge that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or myths, but reality itself. I drove through the forest on a road that seemed to disappear as the sun dipped behind the tall pine trees. The sky was a dull orange, fading into gray as evening approached. I had rented a small, isolated cabin to spend a week alone, hoping for peace and a break from the noise of the city. The GPS signal had already been unreliable for miles, and my phone showed only one bar. That didn't bother me much. In fact, I wanted to escape, to disconnect. But as I drove deeper into the woods, I noticed how quiet it had become. So quiet that even the sound of my car engine seemed too loud, echoing off unseen surfaces among the trees. The road narrowed, dirt replacing asphalt, and I had to slow down to avoid potholes and exposed roots. Shadows stretched across the path, twisting in the fading light, and I realized that by the time I reached the cabin, it would already be dark. I didn't mind, though. I liked the idea of arriving at night, having the cabin to myself with only the forest around me. When I finally spotted the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures online. Small, made of dark wood, with a steep roof and a chimney that hinted at a fireplace inside. It was nestled in a clearing, surrounded by tall trees that almost touched the sky. I parked my car on the narrow driveway and stepped out. The air smelled sharp, pine-heavy, and clean, and a cool wind brushed against my face. I carried my backpack and the small bag of supplies I had brought and walked up to the door. Inside, the cabin was rustic but clean. Wooden floors creaked slightly under my weight, and the furniture was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace sat in the corner of the living room, and I could see the kitchen tucked along one wall. There were shelves filled with cooking supplies and a stack of firewood near the door. Upstairs, a narrow staircase led to a small loft with a bed and a window overlooking the clearing. I set my things down and felt a rush of relief. The isolation, the quiet, it was exactly what I had wanted. I unpacked slowly, taking time to inspect the cabin. The windows were old, with tiny cracks in the glass, and the doors had simple latches. I checked the locks carefully, making sure they worked. My rational mind told me there was nothing to fear here, yet a faint tension clung to the edges of my thoughts. The kind of tension that comes when you are completely alone, surrounded by nothing but forest. Night fell quickly. I lit a fire in the fireplace and made a simple dinner. The soft crackle of flames, the only sound besides the occasional gust of wind brushing against the cabin walls. After eating, I sat on the floor near the fire, reading a book I had brought. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows like a thick, black curtain. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement in the shadows beyond the glass, but each time I looked closer, there was nothing, just the sway of branches or the play of moonlight. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan and sway, and I felt the first real twinge of unease. The cabin was supposed to be secure, but I realized that the sound of the wind made the walls seem fragile. Lying in the loft bed, I could hear small creaks in the floorboards, the faint scrape of wood against wood. I told myself it was normal, that the house was old, that I was imagining things. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sharp sound. A knock, soft but deliberate, on the door of the cabin. My heart jumped, and for a moment I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind. But the knock came again, then again, slow and rhythmic. I stayed still, listening, trying to rationalize it, but my mind kept running through possibilities. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the cabin's remote location made it unlikely anyone would stumble here in the middle of the night. Whoever or whatever it was, I realized, was waiting. I grabbed my phone, but as I suspected, there was no signal. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and crept to the door. I checked through the small window, but the darkness outside swallowed everything. My instincts screamed at me to run, to grab my keys and get back in the car, but I also knew that running into the woods in the dark might be even worse. I returned to the bed, sat there gripping a heavy flashlight I had packed, and waited, straining to hear. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, a faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. They weren't continuous, they would stop, then start again, slow and methodical. My mind raced. Whoever it was couldn't see me, but they could hear the house, and they were clearly close. I considered barricading myself in the loft, but the only way up was the staircase, and if someone forced the door, there would be no way to escape quickly. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the wind and the occasional, eerie movement outside. At first light, the forest was gray and wet, dew clinging to the leaves and the dirt path leading to the cabin. I finally summoned the courage to look outside. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The knock, the footsteps, everything had vanished with the night. My stomach churned, and I realized that I could not spend another night wondering if someone was circling the cabin. I packed what I could carry quickly, leaving non-essential items behind, and went outside, scanning the forest. My car was there, untouched, and I climbed in without looking back. I drove carefully, eyes flicking constantly to the side of the road, heart still pounding from the fear of what might have been waiting in the trees. It was late morning by the time I reached the main road, and I stopped at the first gas station I found. I called the local authorities to report the strange noises at the cabin, but after explaining my situation, they told me that cabins this remote often had wildlife noises mistaken for people, and no one had reported suspicious activity nearby. I wanted to argue, to tell them I had heard deliberate knocking, deliberate footsteps, but the words caught in my throat. It sounded unbelievable. I spent the day in a nearby town, trying to calm down and plan my next move. My instinct was to forget the cabin, to leave it behind entirely. But I also realized that the fear I felt had been fueled by isolation and imagination. I resolved to return later, during the day, with more preparation. A week later, I went back, this time with a friend and 2 fully charged phones, a first aid kit, and extra supplies. The day was bright and clear, the forest almost beautiful in its stillness. We approached the cabin together. Everything seemed normal. The doors intact, the windows unbroken, the firewood stacked neatly. No evidence of anyone else had been there, no footprints or signs of intrusion. We explored thoroughly. I checked the windows, doors, and even the surrounding forest, looking for any clue. The cabin was as secure as I could make it. We spent the night there, both of us awake for long stretches, but nothing happened. The noises I had imagined the first night were gone, replaced by the peaceful sounds of the forest. Birds sang at dawn, the wind whispered through the trees, and the fear that had seemed so overwhelming before slowly dissolved. By the end of the trip, I realized that my terror had come from a combination of isolation, darkness, and the mind's natural tendency to fill gaps with imagined threats. I had survived the night alone, and when I returned with company and proper preparation, the cabin was safe. It was a powerful reminder of the way fear can grow when we are alone and unsure, and also of the relief that comes when we confront our fears with logic and preparation. I left the cabin for the last time with a clear mind and a calm heart, having learned to respect isolation without letting it control me. The forest was beautiful, the cabin was sturdy, and though my first night had been frightening, I left knowing that fear could be managed, and that even in the darkest and most remote places, careful preparation and rational thinking could restore safety and peace. It started as a normal trip. I had been planning it for months. A solo getaway to a remote cabin tucked away in the forest. My work life had been draining me, leaving me constantly exhausted, and I needed time away from everyone, from the noise, from the constant hum of the city. I wanted silence, I wanted stillness, and I thought a week alone in a cabin in the woods would provide exactly that. I had picked a cabin listed online, small and old but well-kept, located several miles from the nearest town. The pictures looked rustic and inviting, with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a wooden porch that overlooked a small clearing. There was no cell phone signal, which had initially excited me. I liked the idea of being truly cut off, of having to rely on myself for everything. I packed carefully, bringing food, water, warm clothes, and a few books. I even brought a small first aid kit because I was cautious. I drove through the winding forest roads, the engine of my old SUV humming along with the occasional bird song that slipped through the window. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, I finally reached the small gravel driveway that led to the cabin. The woods were quiet in a way that made my skin tingle, deep, dense, and dark. There were no other houses nearby, just the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The cabin itself was smaller than I had imagined, but it had a certain charm. The wooden structure creaked slightly as I pushed open the front door, the hinges groaning like they had not been used for a while. Inside, the smell of old wood and faint smoke from previous fires welcomed me. Dust motes floated in the golden light streaming through the windows. I set down my bags and began to explore. The cabin had a single bedroom, a small bathroom, and a combined kitchen living area with a fireplace that had not been cleaned recently but seemed usable. I unpacked my things, stacked some firewood near the fireplace, and made a mental note to light it later. Night came quickly in the forest. The darkness outside was dense, almost physical, pressing against the windows and the walls. The sounds of the forest changed too, squirrels rustling in the undergrowth, an occasional distant howl of a coyote, the constant whisper of the wind through the trees. I had been alone many times before, camping in remote areas, but the cabin felt different. It was enclosed, solid, and yet, somehow, the isolation made it more intense. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the stove and sat by the fireplace as the fire crackled and warmed the room. I tried to read, but my focus kept drifting to the sounds outside. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest being alive. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cabin had only one small window in the bedroom, and the darkness outside felt thick, like a wall. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shadows moving just outside the glass, flickering between the trees. I kept my flashlight close, and I could not help but glance at the door repeatedly. The wind picked up at some point, rattling the windows and causing the floorboards to groan, and I lay awake listening to every tiny sound. Somewhere in the night, a branch must have fallen nearby, because there was a sharp crash that echoed through the woods. My heart jumped, and I sat up straight in bed, my ears straining to hear anything else. But there was only silence afterward, deep and heavy, and eventually, exhaustion took over, dragging me into a restless sleep. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I made coffee on the small stove and opened the cabin door to step onto the porch. The forest looked different in the light of day. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating patterns of gold and green on the ground. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the wind was gentler. I reminded myself that during the day, the forest was just a forest. The danger I imagined at night was only my mind playing tricks on me. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area, walking through the trees, and noting how the terrain changed. There were small streams, uneven ground, and thick brush in some places. The isolation I had craved seemed to fill me with a sense of peace during the daylight hours. It was the third night that things began to feel different. I had been out for most of the day, wandering farther than I had planned, and I returned as the sun was setting, the shadows already lengthening in the forest. I noticed something immediately: tracks, footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. They were not mine, and they were fresh. I froze, scanning the trees, but I could see nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a hunter or someone hiking nearby, but something in the shape of the prints made my stomach twist. They were irregular, larger than a human foot, and they led toward the cabin. They did not circle back, only came toward the porch and stopped at the edge of the clearing. My mind raced. I had chosen this cabin for solitude, but now it felt like someone or something had been watching me. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure they were locked, and then I sat in the living area, heart pounding, trying to listen to the forest. Every snapping twig, every brush of leaves, sent a shiver down my spine. The wind picked up again, and this time it sounded like a whispering, a soft scraping against the side of the cabin. I refused to look out, afraid of what I might see. I kept the fire burning all night, sitting close to it, and I made a mental note that the next day I would pack up and leave if I saw anything unusual again. I had told myself this was about peace, about being alone, but now I wondered if I had made a mistake. Night fell quickly. The forest became a different place altogether. Sounds amplified, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of an animal. Every noise made my heart race. I clutched my flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the dark, trying to reassure myself that I wasn't alone. The wind picked up, and I could hear it through the trees. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, shivering, but I stayed awake, watching and listening. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps, not in the distance, but close, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, moving around my little clearing. I froze, trying to control my breathing. I called out, but my voice seemed to vanish into the darkness. The sounds moved around me, circling, then stopped. I had no idea what it was. Another hiker, a wild animal, or something else entirely. But I stayed still, hoping to be unnoticed. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was hard to tell in the night, but eventually, everything fell silent again. Morning came slowly. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, and I felt relief I couldn't describe. I packed up my makeshift camp and tried to figure out where to go. I remembered a small stream I had crossed the day before. Following water downhill seemed logical, so I started moving carefully, keeping an eye out for tracks and landmarks. Hours later, I finally recognized a bend in the stream where I had rested before. My spirits lifted. I continued along the water, and eventually, I spotted the clearing with the cabin in the distance. The sight of it filled me with relief so intense that I almost ran the last few hundred meters. I reached the cabin, exhausted, covered in dirt and scratches from the underbrush, but I was safe. I spent the rest of the day repairing the small cuts on my arms and legs, resting, and ensuring the cabin was secure. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and reinforced the wood stove area. The sense of isolation that had been thrilling the day before now felt protective. I realized how dangerous it could have been to wander so far without proper equipment or knowledge. Over the next few days, I stayed close to the cabin. I explored only nearby trails, always marking my path and making sure I could return quickly. I learned to listen to the forest, to identify the sounds of animals versus the sounds of the wind. I gathered firewood, cooked my meals, and slept with a sense of vigilance I had never known in the city. The fear had not gone away entirely, but I understood it, respected it, and it made me careful. By the end of the week, I had grown stronger, more alert, and far more aware of my surroundings than I had ever been. I realized that the experience had changed me, not in a supernatural way, but in a very real, physical, and mental way. I had faced real danger, getting lost, exposure, and the uncertainty of the wilderness. And I had survived because I had stayed calm, thought ahead, and respected the environment around me. When I finally packed up to leave, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and accomplishment. The cabin, which had seemed quaint and peaceful at first, now felt like a safe haven I had learned to protect. I drove back down the winding road, through the hills and fields, and eventually reached the city. The noise and chaos felt overwhelming at first, but I carried with me a quiet confidence I hadn't known before. I had been alone in the wild, faced real fear, and come out intact. Even now, years later, I remember that week in the cabin as the most intense, frightening, and ultimately empowering experience of my life. It taught me how fragile life can be, how quickly circumstances can turn dangerous, and how important it is to prepare, observe, and respect the world around us. That week had been terrifying, exhausting, and full of mistakes, but it had a clear ending. I survived, I learned, and I grew. The forest still calls me sometimes. I can remember the scent of pine, the sound of the wind, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I know that if I return, I will be far better prepared. But I also know that the fear, the uncertainty, and the need for vigilance are always real. And in that reality, I found something no city, no office, no daily routine could ever give me. A sense of true, unshakable clarity. I had been planning the trip for months, imagining a quiet retreat in the mountains, far from the chaos of the city. Work had been relentless, my days swallowed by deadlines, emails, and meetings that seemed to stretch endlessly. My mind ached for silence, for the kind of solitude that makes the world shrink to just the air around you and the rhythm of your own breathing. I wanted a place where I could think, maybe even rest, without being disturbed. That's how I ended up driving along the winding roads that led to the cabin I had rented. A small wooden structure tucked into a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. The drive had been long, the kind where the scenery changes slowly, from the flat suburbs to rolling hills, then to thick woods. By the time I reached the trailhead where my GPS insisted the cabin would be, the sun was low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and red. The forest smelled rich and earthy, a mix of pine and damp soil, and I could hear the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. It felt peaceful, almost unreal, like the world had shrunk to just me and the trees. I parked the car and unloaded my bag. The cabin was a 20-minute walk along a narrow path that seemed almost swallowed by the forest. The path was uneven, roots twisting across it like veins, fallen leaves cushioning my steps. Every few minutes I paused to look around. The light was fading quickly, and the shadows were stretching in strange shapes, making familiar forms look unfamiliar. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was normal. It always felt a little unsettling to be so deep in the woods, alone. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt relief wash over me. It was small, made of weathered logs, with a tin roof that gleamed faintly under the last rays of the sun. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I knew no one else was supposed to be there. The windows were dirty but transparent enough to reveal a simple interior. A modest living space, a kitchen corner with a wood stove, a small table, and 2 beds pushed against opposite walls. There were stacks of firewood by the door, and the air smelled faintly of wood and old dust. I set my bag down and fumbled with the keys. When I opened the door, the air inside was cooler, heavier somehow, like it was holding the memory of all the years it had been standing there, empty. I flicked on the small battery-powered lantern I had brought, and it cast a yellow glow over the walls. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked across the cabin. I checked the stove, the sink, the small fridge. Everything seemed functional. The cabin was isolated, and that was both comforting and intimidating. I unpacked my things, laid out a simple dinner, and built a small fire in the stove. Outside, the forest had gone completely dark. The last traces of sunlight disappeared, and the night took over with an almost oppressive weight. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch somewhere nearby, the sound sharp and startling in the stillness. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer or a fox, maybe even just the wind pushing through the trees. I slept in one of the beds that night, and even though I was exhausted, sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise seemed amplified in the dark. The wind whistled through gaps in the cabin walls, and every creak of the wood made my heart jump. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint scratching noise outside the window. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something trying to get at the firewood stacked nearby. I lay still, listening. The scratching came again, slow and deliberate, and then a thump, like something heavy had brushed against the side of the cabin. I got out of bed carefully, not wanting to make a sound. I picked up the small flashlight I had by the bed and edged toward the window. Peering out, I saw nothing but darkness. The forest was thick, and in the dim light of my flashlight, the trees looked like towering black shapes. The scratching noise continued, this time coming from the back of the cabin. My stomach tightened, and I realized my imagination was already running wild. Still, I had to see. The following morning, I decided to investigate the tracks during daylight. The prints were gone, wiped clean by overnight wind or rain, but the sense of being watched remained. I walked carefully around the perimeter of the cabin, checking the underbrush, the tree lines, the small path leading into the woods. Nothing appeared out of place. I breathed a little easier, convincing myself that it had probably been some hiker who had wandered close to the cabin and left. Yet, as I stepped back toward the cabin, I noticed something else. Small scratches on the doorframe. Not deep, not large, but deliberate, as if someone had tried to pry the door open slightly or had brushed against it with something sharp. My stomach sank. These marks had not been there when I arrived. I spent the next day trying to keep busy, chopping some wood for the fireplace, cleaning the cabin, and walking around the clearing. The forest seemed more alive than ever, every sound amplified by my awareness. That night, I set up a rudimentary alarm. I stacked a few empty cans on a thin rope across the clearing so that if anyone approached, they would rattle loudly. I did not know why I was so sure someone might come. Perhaps it was paranoia, but the tracks and scratches had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow, and when the wind rattled the windows, I sat up, listening, straining my ears for any sound that might signal someone approaching. The fourth day, things escalated. I had been out exploring a small creek deeper in the woods, trying to lose myself in nature, when I noticed fresh prints again. This time they were larger, deeper, and appeared to circle my path back toward the cabin. My pulse quickened. I hurried back, my legs trembling with adrenaline and fear. The cabin looked the same, peaceful in the sunlight, but the clearing had changed subtly. There were faint marks on the porch steps, and one of the cans I had set up the night before had been knocked over. It was not windy. I had checked. Someone or something had been there while I was away. Panic began to settle in. I thought about leaving immediately, but the road back to civilization was a rough, winding trail and nightfall was approaching again. I decided to stay inside, barricading the door as best as I could, moving heavy furniture in front of it. I stacked chairs and tables against the doorframe, wedging the heavy oak table in place. I set another fire in the fireplace, bigger this time, hoping the warmth and light would provide a sense of security. Every shadow in the cabin felt like it was moving. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the building, sounded like someone stepping inside. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, listening for hours. Nothing came. The fifth day, I realized I could not keep living in fear. I needed to find out what was happening, but cautiously. I walked carefully around the cabin, checking for signs, for clues. I found broken twigs, small depressions in the ground, and again, subtle scratches near the windows. Whoever had been there was clever, careful, avoiding leaving large evidence but making it clear they had been close, testing boundaries. I remembered the nearest town was miles away, and I had no cell signal. I realized I had to leave before nightfall or risk being trapped, alone, with someone who had been watching me without my knowledge. I packed as quickly as I could, taking only essentials, leaving behind most of my gear, hoping the minimalism would allow me to move faster. I left the cabin quietly, checking the trees for any movement. The forest was unnervingly still, the wind reduced to occasional rustles. I drove out as quickly as the rough road allowed, constantly scanning the sides of the trail, imagining eyes watching me. The tension was unbearable, every mile feeling like an eternity. By the time I reached the main road, civilization in sight, relief washed over me like a wave. I pulled over briefly, my hands shaking, my heart still pounding. I thought about what had happened. The tracks, the scratches, the knocked-over can. It had all been real, tangible evidence that someone had been close, observing. It was terrifying to realize how vulnerable I had been. The forest had been beautiful, peaceful in the day, but at night, it had become a place of potential danger. A reminder that isolation carries risks that can't always be predicted. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it, cut all ties to the location, and told myself it was an experience I would never repeat. I learned that solitude is a fragile thing, dependent not only on your own comfort but also on the unpredictable presence of others. And sometimes, even in places that seem harmless and quiet, there can be very real threats, hiding just beyond the trees, watching, waiting, testing the limits of your awareness and courage. Weeks later, I learned from a local ranger that there had been reports of a man living in the woods nearby, someone who would follow hikers and occasionally trespass near cabins. He was eventually arrested, but the details were scarce. It was enough to confirm my fears. I had been lucky, but I had also learned a lesson I would carry forever. Nature may be beautiful, but isolation, even in a cabin that feels safe, comes with a vulnerability that cannot be ignored. From that day onward, I always checked my surroundings carefully. I always let someone know where I would be, and I never underestimated the forest again. The experience stayed with me, not just as fear, but as a detailed, vivid memory of tension, observation, and survival. Even now, years later, I can recall every scratch on the doorframe, every rustle of leaves, every shadow cast by the flickering fire, and I remember how it felt to be truly alone, truly observed, and yet, somehow able to get away. I never imagined that a simple weekend getaway in the woods could turn into one of the most intense and frightening experiences of my life. I had always been drawn to the idea of escaping the city, the noise, the endless obligations, and spending a few days alone somewhere quiet, somewhere far from other people. The cabin I found online seemed perfect. It was tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, and surrounded by nothing but tall pine trees and rolling hills. The listing promised solitude, fresh air, and a chance to disconnect from everything. I didn't realize that solitude could become dangerous in ways I had never considered. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky low and gray, clouds stretched thin and heavy across the horizon. Driving up the narrow dirt road, I noticed how uneven it was, filled with potholes and scattered rocks. My small rental car rattled with every bump. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the forest had begun to darken, the sun dropping behind the dense tree line. The cabin itself was modest, built of weathered wood. Its paint faded to a dull gray. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, though I wasn't sure if it was smoke from a fireplace or just a trick of the wind. A small wooden porch ran along the front, and the steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. The living area had a small couch, a wooden table, and a stone fireplace. A tiny kitchen sat to one side, complete with a stove, sink, and a small fridge. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom. Dust hung faintly in the corners, and the floorboards groaned underfoot, but otherwise, it was exactly as described online. I put down my bags, lit the fireplace, and unpacked a small bag of supplies I had brought. Some food, water, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. I had thought of everything. The first night was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I sat in the small living room, listening to the wind move through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch falling somewhere in the forest. I felt safe, cocooned in the cabin with the fire warming the room. Around midnight, I finally went to bed, leaving the fire to die down. It was around 2 a.m. that the first unease set in. I woke to a faint noise, a rustling that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. I froze, listening carefully. The sound came from outside, somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound. I peered out the window, my eyes straining in the darkness. The trees swayed gently, the shadows shifting. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the movements were too precise, too measured. Something or someone was moving through the trees, keeping its distance, but watching. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was as it should be. I rationalized it. The forest was alive at night. Animals moved. Wind played tricks. I went back to bed, but sleep would not come easily after that. Every small noise, a snapping twig, a rustling branch, made me tense. I kept imagining a figure just beyond the treeline, staring, waiting. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the daylight hours exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I walked for hours trying to push the fear out of my mind. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement through the trees, shadows flitting just at the edge of my vision. But whenever I looked directly, nothing was there. I told myself it was paranoia, that I had come to a remote area and my mind was filling in the gaps. As evening approached, I returned to the cabin. The air had grown colder, and the wind had picked up. I set another fire, made a simple meal, and tried to keep my mind occupied. But as night fell, the noises began again, this time louder and closer. I could hear something moving around the perimeter of the cabin, slow, deliberate steps on the fallen leaves and underbrush. I turned on all the lights, grabbed my flashlight, and started checking the windows and doors again. Everything was locked. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small footpath, barely wide enough for a person, leading from the treeline to the cabin. It was flattened, as if someone had walked it recently. My stomach turned. I had been careful about leaving any signs of my presence, and there was no reason for anyone else to be out here. My mind raced. Could it have been someone who lived nearby? A hiker who had seen my car? But the cabin was supposed to be isolated, and there was no cell reception, no neighbors for miles. I stayed up that night, fire dying down in the fireplace, flashlight in hand. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind brushing against the roof, the trees shifting, a branch snapping somewhere in the distance. My imagination filled in shapes, figures lurking just beyond the window. I checked the locks again. I even considered barricading the door, though it was sturdy. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was safe inside, but the fear gnawed at me, constant and sharp. The third day, the sense of being watched intensified. During the afternoon, I went to the small stream a few hundred meters from the cabin to fill water bottles. The forest was quiet, almost oppressively so. I noticed signs of someone else's passage. Broken branches, footprints in the soft earth, flattened grass. The footprints were large, heavier than mine, and went in circles near the water before disappearing back into the woods. I felt my pulse quicken. Whoever had been following me, or whoever lived nearby, was now close enough to track my movements. I returned to the cabin with a knot in my stomach, realizing that the isolation that had drawn me here now made me vulnerable. I considered leaving, but the dirt road was long and treacherous, and nightfall was approaching. I decided to stay and make sure the cabin was secure. I moved furniture to block the doors, placed heavy objects against the windows, and prepared mentally for a long night. Night came again, darker and colder than before. The noises resumed, now constant and unmistakable. Footsteps circling the cabin, scratching at the wooden siding, rustling through the leaves. At one point, I heard a deliberate knock on the door, muffled but loud enough to make my heart race. I did not respond. I stayed as quiet as possible, flashlight ready, listening to the movements. The noises continued for hours, never leaving, always near. My fear grew into something more primal. The fear of a real person, of someone who meant to cause harm, watching me in the darkness. I realized I had to find a way to signal for help. There was no phone reception, and the nearest house was miles away. I had a small emergency radio, but it needed batteries I hadn't brought. I thought about using the car, but the driveway was hidden by the trees, and if someone was out there, they could ambush me. I spent the night planning, keeping track of every sound, every shadow. I barely slept. At dawn, I decided to take a risk. I needed water, food, and a chance to escape. I packed a small bag with essentials, grabbed my flashlight, and waited until the first light touched the treetops. The forest seemed almost silent in the pale morning light. Carefully, I moved toward the car, keeping low, avoiding the open spaces. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I froze. Footprints led from the tree-line to the cabin, clearly showing that someone had been there overnight. My heart pounded. I had no choice. I ran, zigzagging through the trees, adrenaline propelling me forward. I reached the car, keys in hand, and started the engine. The gravel driveway crunched loudly under the tires, but I didn't care. As I drove down the road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The forest was empty, but I knew it hadn't been. Whoever had been near the cabin was gone, at least for now, but the fear remained. I drove for hours, eventually finding a small gas station in a town miles away. I called the local sheriff and reported the cabin, the footprints, the noises. They said there had been occasional reports of trespassers in the area, but nothing like what I described. They offered to send someone, but by then, I was already on my way back to the city. It took weeks before I could think about the experience without a tightening in my chest. I realized that the woods, the isolation, the quiet I had craved, could also be a trap. There were no ghosts, no monsters from fairy tales. There was just the reality that being alone in the wrong place at the wrong time could put a person in real danger. Eventually, I told myself that I had learned something crucial. I had survived, but survival was not just about staying alive. It was about awareness, preparation, and respect for the environment and the unknown. I never returned to that cabin. I researched other cabins carefully, made sure someone knew my plans, and always checked the area thoroughly before spending the night. The experience left me more cautious, more aware of the dangers that can exist even in places that seem peaceful and safe. Looking back, I can see now that fear is a real, physical thing. It shapes decisions, sharpens senses, and sometimes saves lives. The cabin was small, the forest silent, and the nights long, but I survived because I didn't underestimate the danger, and because I refused to let panic take control. The memory of those nights in the cabin stays with me, a reminder that the world is full of quiet threats, and that solitude, while tempting, is never without risk. In the end, I learned to respect isolation, not romanticize it. I learned that survival is about observation, strategy, and caution. I also learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that no amount of planning can fully eliminate risk, but preparation and awareness can make the difference between being trapped and finding your way out. I had been driving all day through narrow, winding roads that cut through dense forests, the kind of roads where sunlight barely touched the asphalt because the trees were so close together. The air outside felt cold, crisp, and heavy with the smell of pine, the kind that makes your lungs feel clean but also reminds you how far you are from anything resembling civilization. I had rented a small cabin deep in these woods for a weekend alone, hoping to escape the constant buzz of the city and the stress that had been building for months. I had imagined peaceful mornings, the sound of birds, the occasional rustle of deer, and quiet nights where the only light came from the stars. But reality was far more complicated, and the weekend quickly turned into one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. The cabin was not far from the main road, but getting to it felt like crossing into a different world. The GPS signal faded as I drove deeper into the forest, leaving only faint traces of my location on the device. By the time I reached the gravel driveway leading to the cabin, the sky had started to darken, and the last hints of daylight were struggling through the thick canopy above. The cabin itself was a modest structure, built of rough, weathered logs, with a small porch that creaked when I stepped on it. Its windows reflected the fading light in uneven rectangles, and I noticed that several panes had accumulated a thin layer of dust. The door was solid, old but well-made, with a rusty metal handle that required a firm grip to turn. I remember thinking how easy it would be for someone or something to hide in the shadows around it. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke, damp earth, and a hint of mildew, the kind of smell that comes from being closed up for weeks. The The furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a kitchenette with a gas stove, and a single bed in the corner with a thin, worn mattress. There was no electricity except for a small solar-powered lamp on the table, and the cabin relied on a wood-burning stove for heat. I dropped my backpack by the door and took a moment to stretch, letting the silence wrap around me. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a river rushing over rocks. After unpacking my things, I decided to gather firewood for the stove. The stack behind the cabin was uneven, pieces of wood piled in a haphazard manner. I worked methodically, carrying logs one by one to the stove and stacking them neatly. Each crack of the wood against the metal made me jump slightly, though I told myself it was just the tension in my body, not anything else. The shadows cast by the firelight danced across the walls, creating shifting patterns that seemed almost alive, though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. As night fell, the forest grew darker and denser. I had underestimated just how little light there would be. I kept the lamp on, but it barely illuminated more than a few feet around me. Every small noise, the snap of a branch outside, the rustle of leaves, the occasional thump that might have been an animal, made me tense. I reminded myself I was alone but safe, that the cabin was solid and the nearest road was only a short walk away if necessary. Still, my imagination began to fill in the spaces where sound and shadow met. Around midnight, I went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the forest seemed to have swallowed all light. I walked slowly, scanning the trees, listening for movement. I carried a flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness like a knife, revealing nothing but trunks and undergrowth. The air smelled damp, earthy, and cold against my skin. Then I heard it. A low, dragging sound, soft but distinct, coming from the trees to the east. It wasn't like an animal moving. It was heavier, deliberate. My pulse quickened, and I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped for a moment, then resumed, slow and methodical, moving closer to the cabin. I rushed back inside, locking the door and sliding a chair against it. My heart was pounding, and my hands shook as I tried to convince myself it was just a bear or a large deer, though neither would drag their feet like that. I checked the windows, solid, locked, but the shadows outside seemed to move independently of the wind, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. I tried to rationalize every sound, every movement, but the logical explanations felt thin and inadequate. The forest was alive in ways I didn't fully understand, and I was painfully aware of how small I was in comparison. I spent the rest of the night in the corner of the cabin, close to the stove, with the fire burning low and my flashlight resting nearby. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me flinch. Sleep was impossible. My body was tense, every sense alert. By the time dawn arrived, pale light filtering through the windows, I realized I had not moved from that corner for hours. I forced myself to stand, stretch, and assess the situation in daylight. The cabin appeared undisturbed. The woods outside looked like any normal forest, birds beginning to chirp tentatively. The dragging sound from the night before had vanished. I tried to leave the cabin that morning, needing fresh air and sanity, but as I stepped outside, I noticed the first unsettling sign. The ground near the side of the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, human-sized, partially obscured by leaves and mud. They hadn't come from the road, but from deeper in the forest, circling the cabin and disappearing behind the trees. My stomach sank. The night hadn't been imagined. Someone had been here. I checked my backpack, my things, all untouched, but the realization that I was not entirely alone in that remote forest gnawed at me. I grabbed my jacket and a sturdy stick from near the stove. Moving quietly, I edged toward the back door. The scratching grew louder as I approached, now accompanied by soft, heavy footsteps crunching through leaves. I stopped at the door, pressed my ear against it, and tried to control my breathing. Then I saw it, the faint glint of eyes catching the light from my flashlight. 2 eyes low to the ground, moving slowly around the back of the cabin. Fear hit me in waves. My first instinct was to call out, to make noise, to scare it off. But the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't a small animal. The size, the posture, it was large, probably a man, crouched, moving carefully. The thought of being completely alone with someone unknown, in a cabin miles from help, made my chest tighten. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the back area, trying to stay calm. I knew I had to act carefully. Running blindly would leave me exposed. I went back inside, locked the door, and moved quietly to the kitchen, where I had kept a small camping knife and a bottle of lighter fluid. I poured some fluid into an empty tin can and set it aside, just in case. Then I tried to think logically. The cabin had a back window I could reach from the outside, and if someone was out there, they might see me inside, but if I stayed completely still, I might get a chance to observe and plan. Hours passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The scratching stopped eventually, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed in on me from all sides. The wind died down. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, and I was trapped inside this fragile wooden box, listening to the stillness. Morning felt like it would never come. Eventually, the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls. I cautiously looked outside. The forest was quiet, but there were footprints in the soft soil around the back and sides of the cabin. Large, heavy boots, not animal tracks. Whoever had been there last night had left in the night, but the evidence was clear. My mind raced. I had survived the night, but that didn't mean I was safe. Someone had been around the cabin, possibly watching me. I spent the next few hours preparing. I fortified the doors as best as I could with the furniture inside, and I packed a small bag with essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, my knife, and my flashlight. I made a plan. I would leave before nightfall, heading back to the main road, sticking to paths and open areas as much as possible. I could not risk staying another night. The walk back was tense, every shadow and sound making me flinch. Birds began to stir in the trees, the wind picked up, and the sun rose higher, revealing the full expanse of the forest. I moved quickly but carefully, avoiding thick underbrush and broken branches that could slow me down. Every step brought relief but also anxiety, because I knew I was still exposed, still vulnerable. I eventually reached the trailhead, where my car was parked. It was as if the world outside the forest had reclaimed me. The normality of the paved road, the distant hum of traffic, the open sky above. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove straight back to the nearest town. Every mile felt like a mile further from danger. By the time I reached a small diner and ordered breakfast, my hands were still shaking, my pulse still high. I never returned to that cabin. Later, I learned that there had been reports of a man living in the woods, someone who had survived on theft and intimidation, hiding from authorities for years. He had been caught shortly after my trip, arrested in a nearby area. I realized how close I had been to encountering him directly, how fragile my safety had been, and how luck and caution had kept me alive. The experience left a mark. I still crave solitude, still love the quiet of the forest, but I have a deeper respect for the dangers of isolation. I carry a small toolkit, extra supplies, and always let someone know exactly where I am. The cabin, once a symbol of escape, now represents a lesson in vigilance and preparation. I survived because I stayed calm, because I observed carefully, and because I refused to make rash decisions. The fear was real, the danger tangible, and the relief of safety afterward was profound. That trip changed how I see solitude, the forest, and the simple act of surviving in a world where you are completely alone. Even now, I can picture the dark shapes of the forest at night, the rustling underfoot, the eyes reflecting light, and I feel a shiver. But I also remember the clarity of morning, the relief of returning to the road, and the deep, grounding knowledge that I survived by thinking and moving carefully. The cabin, the forest, and the night are memories I carry vividly, lessons embedded in every instinct I now have when venturing into the wilderness. I had been driving for most of the day, leaving behind the crowded city and its noise, searching for a place where I could finally feel alone. My plan was simple: rent a small cabin deep in the forest, far from other people, and spend a week disconnecting from everything. I was tired of constant notifications, endless meetings, and the ceaseless buzz of urban life. By the time I turned off the main road onto the gravel path that led to the cabin, the sun was already low, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the air began to feel cooler, carrying a scent of pine and damp earth. The forest seemed alive around me, every sound sharper because there was no city to drown it out. Birds called to each other in the distance, and occasionally, I heard the faint rustle of something moving through the underbrush. The cabin itself appeared suddenly through the trees. It was small and rustic, built from dark, weathered logs with a sloping roof and a simple wooden porch. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, suggesting that someone had recently been there or that the caretaker had lit the fire in preparation for my arrival. I parked my car near the porch and stepped out, immediately noticing the silence. Even with the wind rustling through the trees, the forest felt quiet in a way that made my skin tingle. The kind of quiet that reminds you how small you are and how little control you really have. The cabin smelled faintly of wood and old smoke. I had chosen it mainly for its isolation, but as I walked around inside, I realized it had a comfort to it, too. A simple kitchen with a small wood stove, a living area with a single armchair and a couch, a table in the corner with a few chairs, and a loft upstairs where I would sleep. There was no television, no internet, only the essentials. A sink, a small refrigerator, a couple of pots, and a stack of firewood. I set down my bag and opened the windows, letting in the smell of pine and the soft hum of the forest. The wind made the branches outside sway, creating long, thin shadows across the wooden floor. I spent the first hour unpacking and settling in, lighting a fire in the stove as the sun sank lower. The flickering light and the warmth of the flames made the cabin feel safer, though the shadows danced along the walls and the corners remained dark. I moved slowly, almost ritualistically, stacking firewood neatly, wiping down the table, and making sure everything was in order. I wanted to feel prepared, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was preparing for. As night fell, the forest outside became even more pronounced. The sounds changed. The rustle of small animals, the occasional snap of a twig, and distant, unidentifiable noises that made me pause and listen. The wind through the trees created a soft, whispering noise that seemed to ebb and flow. I sat in the armchair with my notebook and a pen, intending to write, but found myself distracted by the forest itself. It was alive in a way that the city never was. Every sound was distinct. Every movement had purpose. I could hear something large moving farther off, breaking branches, making the earth shift under its weight. My mind wandered to all the possible animals in the forest. Deer, bears, maybe even wolves. The thought made me tense, but I reminded myself that I was in a cabin and that, realistically, none of them could reach me inside. Around midnight, I went upstairs to the loft. I had chosen a cabin that was elevated slightly off the ground to keep out moisture and small animals, but the floorboards creaked with every step. The loft was small, just enough space for the mattress I had brought, a lantern, and a small bag with my essentials. I lit the lantern and placed it on the floor beside the bed. The light was weak, but it illuminated the loft enough to make it comfortable. I lay down, listening to the wind and the sounds of the forest. My body relaxed, but my mind stayed alert. There was something about being in such complete isolation that sharpened every sense, made every sound seem more significant than it was. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by noises that I could not immediately identify. A branch scraping against the side of the cabin, the soft scuffle of an animal on the roof, the occasional rustle that sounded as if something had brushed past the windows. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that all of it was natural, but even knowing that did little to calm my nerves. When I finally slept, it was light, fitful, and full of dreams where the forest pressed in closer than it did in reality. The next morning, I woke to the smell of damp wood and the faint coolness of the morning air. I dressed quickly, made a small breakfast, and stepped outside. The sun had barely risen, and the forest was covered in mist. Everything looked different in the light. Shadows stretched longer, the trees loomed larger, and the forest floor seemed almost infinite. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. A small path led downhill, winding through thick underbrush and older trees. I followed it carefully, noting the tracks in the mud, deer, squirrels, maybe a fox. Every few steps, I heard something else. The sharp snap of a twig, the soft pad of feet over leaves, and something heavier in the distance. My pace slowed. I stayed on the path, careful not to stray. By afternoon, I returned to the cabin, my legs tired but my mind clearer. I prepared a simple lunch, listening to the forest outside. The isolation that had felt overwhelming the night before now felt like relief. I was alone, truly alone, and there was something comforting in that. The hours passed slowly, each one marked by the shifting light, the changing sounds of the forest, and the warmth of the fire. I read, I wrote, I organized the cabin further. I was careful with every sound I made, as if the forest itself could hear and judge me. The second night, the isolation began to feel heavier. The sounds outside were sharper, closer, more deliberate. The wind was stronger, shaking the cabin slightly, and the trees pressed against the walls with each gust. I stayed in the living room, tending the fire longer, trying to push away the tension. The longer I listened, the more I noticed subtle details. The scratch of claws against bark, the soft thump of something moving on the ground outside, the faint crack of twigs breaking under weight. I knew it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but my imagination drew larger possibilities. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A deliberate sound at the back of the cabin, near the woodpile. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the sound came again, slower, heavier. Something was moving deliberately, testing the area. I froze, listening carefully. The wind was still, the trees barely moving, and whatever was outside was making the sound intentionally. My heart pounded. I reminded myself that humans sometimes come to cabins to steal firewood, or maybe hunters passed nearby. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the back door. The beam of light swept over the woodpile. Nothing. No footprints, no animals. Only shadows shifting in the moonlight. I returned to the living room and sat near the fire, feeling my pulse slow. I was aware of every detail. The smell of burning wood, the sound of the fire popping, the way shadows from the flames flickered across the walls. I realized I had become more alert than I had ever been. Every nerve tuned to the environment. Every sense stretched to its limits. Sleep that night was impossible. I sat in the armchair until dawn, listening, waiting, imagining, and reminding myself constantly that I was safe inside. The next day, I explored farther from the cabin. I wanted to prove to myself that the forest outside was benign, that the sounds I had heard were nothing unusual. The path led deeper into the forest, past a small creek and into thicker woods. I marked my way carefully, checking for signs of danger. I saw tracks that were difficult to identify, scat that I could not place, and occasionally, movement in the underbrush that vanished before I could get a good look. I carried a heavy stick, not because I expected to fight anything, but because it gave me some sense of control. By evening, I returned to the cabin with a newfound respect for the forest. It was beautiful, vast, and alive, but it was also indifferent. The sounds that had frightened me were part of its natural rhythm. I prepared dinner, stacking wood for the night, and tried to keep my mind calm. I noticed small things I had missed before. The way the smoke curled from the chimney, the sound of water dripping from the roof after a brief rain, the way the firelight reflected on the walls. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, a small space where I could control my environment in a world that was otherwise chaotic and unpredictable. That night, I slept better. The sounds outside were still there, but I had accepted them. I understood them in a way I hadn't before. The wind, the rustle of animals, the shift of the trees. All of it was natural, and I could coexist with it safely. I awoke the next morning with the sun streaming through the windows, the smell of pine strong and comforting. I packed my bags and cleaned the cabin, making sure to leave it as I had found it. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not just for surviving the nights, but for facing my own fears and understanding them. As I drove away down the gravel path, I looked back at the cabin one last time. It had been more than just a place to stay. It had been a test, a challenge, a confrontation with my own awareness and caution. The forest continued on, vast and eternal, indifferent to my presence. But I left knowing that I had learned something important. Fear is manageable when you respect your environment, pay attention to details, and trust yourself. The city could wait. The noise could wait. I had found a place where I could exist fully aware, fully present, and fully alive. The journey back to the city was quiet, the road long, and my mind replaying the sights, sounds, and sensations of the cabin. I felt a strange mix of relief and longing. Relief because I had faced the fear of isolation and survived. Longing because the cabin, the forest, and the simplicity of being alone with myself had felt more real and vital than anything I experienced in weeks, months, or years in the city. I knew I would return. I knew that someday I would seek that quiet, that isolation, that confrontation with the unknown, and I would be ready for it again.